It seems like everyone has craft sticks on hand, so I put together a mega video of all the ways that I've used craft sticks in my DIYs. So grab a beverage and come hang out with me in the craft room. The wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree are a great way to make a quick new piece of wall decor for your home. I already have this one on hand, and in addition to that, I'm going to be using a stretch canvas that I got from Michael's. This one measures 10 inches by 20 inches, and I'm going to be using some of these giant wooden craft sticks that I get at Walmart. For this project, I don't need the canvas, I just need the frame, so I'm using my staple remover and I'm pulling the staples out of the back of the frame. I'll hold on to this canvas material though, because it always comes in handy for other projects. There is a hole at the top of this wooden cutout, and I had a few options here. I could have filled in that hole, I could have left it there, but I do have this tool called A Dile, and it punches through really thick materials, so I decided just to add a few more holes and make it look like it was part of the design of this wooden cutout. I'm so glad that the weather's finally warm enough that I can start using spray paint again. So I have this Rust-Oleum 2x Ultra Coverage in whites. Normally I buy the flat, but this time I decided to try the high gloss. So I took my frame and my wooden cutout outside and I gave each of these one good coat. When I came back to look at them, they did look a little dull, so I added a second coat, and that's when you could really see that high gloss finish. These giant craft sticks that I'm using were just a bit too wide for the frame that I had, so I just needed to go through and cut the tip off of one side of each of my craft sticks. Now it's up to you if you want to paint these craft sticks or not. I'm trying to save a little time here, and I really do like the lighter wood color of these craft sticks, so I'm just gluing them right on as is. I started with some hot glue on the back, and starting at the bottom of the frame, I just glued down one of the craft sticks, and then I worked my way up to the top. The last thing I needed to do to finish this craft was add hot glue to the back side of my wooden cutout, and then I just centered it inside my frame. The next time you're at Dollar Tree, keep an eye out for these larger wall stickers that they have. When you combine these with some of that canvas material, you can create a really simple wall hanging. I took one of the smaller pieces of the material and I cut all of the excess off. It was really easy to do this because there are crease lines where it wrapped around the frame. So I was able to cut right along those lines to get a nice even piece of canvas. I have these giant craft sticks that I got from Walmart, so I took 4 of them and I cut them down to be about a ½ an inch wider than my piece of canvas. I think after I had cut that canvas material down, it was about 6 inches, so I cut each of these sticks down to 6½ inches. You can paint or stain these sticks any color you'd like, but for my project, I decided to keep mine just the natural wood. I ran a bead of hot glue along the bottom of one of the sticks and I laid my canvas on top of it. Then I took another one of the sticks and I put a good amount of hot glue all over the surface, and I kind of sandwiched that canvas in between the 2 sticks. And then I repeated that on the bottom of the canvas as well. I took some ribbon from my stash. I added hot glue to the edges of both of the sides of the craft sticks, and then I added hot glue to the back side of the canvas and wrapped the ribbon around to the back. I repeated that on the top too to create a border in the center of each of the craft sticks. To make an interesting hanger for this wall hanging, I decided to take some jute cord. I glued it to one side of the canvas and I added some clear tape just to make it secure. Then I strung on 6 wooden beads and I hot glued the other side of the string to the other side of the canvas, so that way when I hung it up I could drop 3 of the beads down to one side and 3 to the other. I added a bunch of greenery to the top of my wall hanging, and I used one of those stickers from that sticker pack from the Dollar Tree that has a little, it looks like an aloe plant to me. I don't know, maybe it's some other kind of succulent. I stuck it in the bottom right hand corner, and then I used my Cricut to cut out a decal that said she believed she could, so she did. But I also think you should keep this in mind because I think these would make really cute Christmas presents. You could put a Christmas saying on there and some Christmas stickers. And of course you could use some Christmas greenery at the top. For the next project, I'm going to create sort of a lantern candle holder type thing. So I'm using 2 of these canvases from the Dollar Tree, and I just need the frame. So I removed all of the canvas, and you'll see later on, at first I didn't remove the staples from the back, but then I realized that they were probably going to show a little bit. So I did go ahead later and remove all of the staples. Next, I'm taking some regular size craft sticks. These are the ones that are about tongue depressor size, and I'm cutting them down to 5 inches. And these craft sticks look funny because I have a cup that I keep on my desk that I put my paintbrushes in as I'm painting, and the one day I knocked the cup over and it spilled all over my sticks. But I wasn't going to throw them out because I knew that more than likely I was going to paint them anyway. So that's why they have a weird grayish tint to them. So I cut down 14 sticks all together, and then I took the Plaster Color by Waverly and I gave the frames and all of the sticks one pretty good coat. I usually never mind if a little bit of the wood shows through because I always like my things to look distressed anyway. And I wasn't planning on distressing this in any way, so by leaving the paint a little bit thinner in areas, it kind of gave it a natural distressing anyway. Once all my paint was dry, it was time to start assembling the box. So I lined up the bottom craft stick on one of the frames, and then I hot glued it to the other frame. That way it kind of gave it a little bit of stability and gave it something to stand on. And then I flipped it over and I glued the other craft stick right across from it, and then I did the top too. That way the box was a little bit stable before I started adding in the slats. So then I lined up my sticks, and I lined up 5 in between the top and the bottom, and I just kind of eyeballed the spacing in between each of them, and I just did that on 2 sides because I wanted to leave the sides with the frames open so that you could see whatever I put inside. So I wasn't too worried if the 2 slats on either side lined up, but it actually worked out pretty well. So next, to create some handles, I'm using some of this nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, and I cut it to the length that I preferred, and I just kind of rolled the one end down so that it created a loop. And then I took some jute and I wrapped it around just to give it a finished look so that you couldn't see the raw edge of the nautical rope, and I just hot glued it in place, and I did that on both ends of the rope just to give it a nice finished look, to look like a little handle for on the side of the lantern. And then to attach it, I just ran some jute through it and tied it onto the top slat on each side of the lantern. To decorate my lantern, I kept it pretty simple. I found these really cool decorative jars at the Dollar Tree. They kind of have that milk jug shape to them, but they have this cool texture on them. So I just wrapped a little bit of jute around the top and tied it in a bow, and then I just stuck in a few bundles of my favorite greenery from the Dollar Tree this year. I wanted to give my tray a really rustic look, so I started with my favorite color of chalk paint, which is the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I started painting it around all of the surfaces. I wouldn't say that I did a dry brush, but I definitely didn't do a full coverage coat either. And for the center of the tray, I was going to cover that up, but I did drop some of the paint into the center also, just to make sure that it had a little bit of paint on it too, in case any of those edges would get exposed. Then for the center of my tray, I took some of these giant craft sticks, and I had measured the inside of my tray, and mine measured about 8 1/8 of an inch wide. So I cut 9 of these giant craft sticks down to about 8 1/8 of an inch. After all my sticks were cut, I went in with another color of the Waverly chalk paint, this time in mineral, and I gave each of the sticks one solid coat of that color. Once all of my paint had dried on the tray and the sticks, then I decided to dry brush all of the pieces in the opposite color. So I went in on the tray and I used the mineral color this time on the tray, and I dry brushed around all the edges and the corners. And then for the craft sticks, I went in with the plaster color and I dry brushed over those to make the sticks and the tray both look very cohesive. Now, if you're not into the farmhouse style, you could definitely still do this look, but you would probably just want to either keep the natural wood or use a stain or just use solid paint colors and not do the dry brushing. I knew I needed there to be a slight gap in between each of the sticks, so to get it as even as possible, I always like to start on the outsides and work my way in. So I glued the 2 outside sticks down first, and then I went from the outsides towards the middle, and as I got closer to the middle, I could start adjusting the little gaps that I needed to leave in between the sticks so that it didn't look like there was a big gap on one side or the other. It just kind of gradually made its way into the center. I forgot to hit record, but I did wrap each of the handles of this tray with some jute cord, and then because my jute cord was a little on the fuzzy side, I decided to take a lighter and burn off all the little fuzzy pieces that were left behind. As a final embellishment for my tray, I decided to cut a decal out on my Cricut that says, "Here comes the sun," and I just applied it to one side of the tray. Now, if you really want to keep this out all year long, you might want to skip this part because this kind of implies that it's only a spring and summer craft, but I think I'll probably keep it out all year long anyway. For the next project, I'm going to be using 2 of these canvas framed art pieces from the Dollar Tree also, and I really liked the shape of these. I liked how long and kind of narrow they were, and I only needed 2 for this project. So I took the canvas off, and again, I wasn't too worried about getting the staples out of the back because the top side was nice and finished. Then I took a pack of these 6-inch dowel rods from the Dollar Tree, and I glued a dowel into each corner of one of the frames, and once I had all 4 dowel rods in place, then I was able to add hot glue to the second frame and glue it onto the other end of the dowel rod, so that way it kind of gave me a rectangular box shape. And once I had the dowel rods in place on both of the frames, I took more hot glue and just reinforced it over the top of the dowel rods just to make it nice and sturdy. To decorate around the outside of the box, I'm using these giant craft sticks that I found at Walmart, and they're significantly bigger than the tongue depressor size. So I took 24 of the sticks and I cut them at various lengths that measured between 6.5 inches and 7 inches. So some were 6.5, some were 7, some were 6 3/4. I just kind of did it at random. But I found that I needed 24 to be able to fit around the outside of the box. So for my craft sticks, I decided to paint them in this English Navy by Apple Barrel and the Truffle and the Mineral Colors by Waverly. Now, you could obviously just paint these all one color, but I wanted to do 3 different colors that I knew would match the furniture that I like to put out on my front porch in the summer. So once I had all 24 sticks painted in those 3 colors, then I took the plaster color by Waverly and I just did some dry brushing all over the sticks. That way, even though the sticks were 3 different colors, by using the plaster color, it kind of tied them all together. So you can see here, once I got all of my sticks dry, I started to attach them on the outside, and I decided to do them in the same pattern. So I went the truffle color, the mineral color, and then the navy color. And I found the best way to do this was to glue 3 sticks down on one side and then glue 3 sticks on the opposite side. And then that way I was able to space out the center sticks a little bit more, because you do need to leave just a tiny little gap in between each stick. Now, I was able to get the sticks on pretty evenly, but the 2 smaller ends, the one side I got 3 sticks on with no problem, but the other side I did have to trim one of the sticks down a little bit lengthwise because it was just a little bit too wide. But that was pretty easy to do with my scissors because the wood grain runs lengthwise, so it's pretty easy to cut them down whenever you need them to be just a little bit narrower. Once all my sticks were glued in place, I took one of these garden decorations from the Dollar Tree, and I really love the watering can that's on there. I just think it's so funny that it says staying alive, because I'm gonna put fake plants in this. So I decided to decorate up the box just a little bit, and I'm using this burlap ribbon that I got at Michael's, and I'm just creating a band with it around the center of the box. And because burlap ribbon, like, the glue tends to seep through a bit, so I tried not to add too much hot glue when I'm wrapping it around something, because you can really see the glue as it comes through. So once I had the ribbon around the center of the box, I took that little watering can and I just created a little bow just to decorate it up a little bit. But I also knew that I needed it to raise up off of the box slightly, so using some of the leftover scraps from the jumbo craft sticks, I just hot glued 3 together just to act as risers, and I hot glued those to the back of the can, and then I was able to attach the watering can to the front of the box. I decided to take this box one step farther, and I created handles using this nautical rope found at the Dollar Tree. So I tied a knot in one end, and then I measured it on the box how long I wanted it, and I just tied another knot, and then I cut the rope as close as I could to the knot. And then when I hot glued it onto the side of the box, the hot glue not only attached it to the box, but it also helped the knot from coming apart. And then I just repeated that on the other side. To close off the bottom of the box, I just traced it onto a piece of scrap chipboard, and then I was able to just hot glue it onto the bottom of the box. I wanted to create a set of coasters that kind of had that pallet wood look, or like I guess maybe even a shiplap look. Now, I know the Dollar Tree sells mini pallets, but sometimes they're kind of hard to find. So I wanted to show you a way that you could kind of create your own. So you can see there, I just took 6 of the tower blocks and I glued them into 3 sets of 2. And then I'm using these larger craft sticks, the super jumbo craft sticks actually from Walmart, and I'm cutting these down to 3 3/4 inches because that's the same length as the tumbling tower blocks when they're glued end on end. And then all I had to do was hot glue each set of the tumbling tower blocks to the ends of the craft sticks, and I laid mine down pretty close together. You could leave a gap here, but the way that I wanted to decorate mine, I knew it would be a little bit difficult if there were gaps in between the sticks. That's why I chose to just lay mine down right next to each other. And you can see there, I did have to trim a little bit off of one of the sticks to get it to fit inside there. Then I took the 3rd set of the tower blocks and I put it in the center because it gave it more of that palette look, and it also made it a little bit more stable as well. And then I glued the 4 sticks onto the back side too. And I chose to leave mine natural, but you could paint these, you could stain them, whatever would fit your decor. Then using that gold paint marker again, I just wrote the word sip on the bottom edge of one of these coasters, and then I'll show you here in a little bit, I wrote another word on a second one. And then to decorate the other 2, I'm using these greenery rub-on transfers from the Dollar Tree, and you can see that greenery wreath fits perfect in the center of these. That's why I didn't want to leave any gaps in between my sticks, because I knew I wanted to use these transfers, and I figured if there were gaps in there, it might be a little bit hard to get those on there. So then for the other one, I just picked out some of the other little random pieces of greenery, and I kind of laid those around until I liked how it looked. And then for the 4th coaster in this set, I decided to write out the word drink. The nautical rope that I use is not from the Dollar Tree. It's actually from Amazon, and I'll try to make sure that that's linked in the description box, but you definitely could use the nautical rope from the Dollar Tree also. And this box art I picked up at the Dollar Tree too. You could pick up any kind of frame or piece of box art that you can find. I just liked this one because it already had a white frame on it. I popped out the piece that was in the middle, and then I gave it 2 coats of the Plaster Color by Waverly. I wasn't too worried if that design covered up the whole way because I knew that I would be covering it up with something else anyway. I just wanted to make sure you couldn't see any of the super dark parts of that design through the paint. I took these giant craft sticks that I get at Walmart and I cut them down to size to fit inside of my box art. So I cut one and you can see I did a test fit to make sure that it would fit inside of there. And at first I cut 6 sticks, but then I end up only using 5 of them. But depending on what type of frame or piece of box that you use, you'll have to just use your judgment to see how many sticks you might need. The 3 colors I chose for my sticks are the Agave, the Ballet Slipper, and the Maze, all by Waverly. But again, this is where you can kind of customize it to fit your style. If you want, you could do everything just neutral, maybe in grays and whites, or you could go kind of modern and paint it black. I think that would look really cool too. And like I said, I originally cut 6 sticks, so I had painted 2 of each color, but I ended up only using 5, and I'll show you what I did with the 5 sticks a little bit later. After all my sticks were dry, I went back through with the Plaster Color again, and I did a dry brushing on all of the sticks to give them that whitewash look. But again, this is optional. If you don't like the distressing, you could leave them plain. Now I could get started on my nautical rope bunny, so I started with my rope and I folded just the tip of it over with a little hot glue to get it started. And this is where a silicone mat really comes in handy because the hot glue won't stick to the mat. And as you're wrapping it around, because it is a little small, you want to make sure that you add hot glue to every area that you're wrapping. So you don't want to leave any gaps where there isn't any hot glue. And this does take a little time, but it goes pretty quickly. You just have to make sure that you keep gluing and wrapping until you get the size of circle that you like. Once my circle was the size that I wanted, I could cut off the excess and hot glue the ends down. And another tip is this is a great way to make a simple set of coasters. Also, you could just keep spiral wrapping nautical rope and make a little set of coasters. I would recommend putting a piece of cork or a piece of felt on the backside. The ears of the bunny are really simple to make also. I just folded the nautical rope over and glued the tip onto itself to make a teardrop shape, and then using that same technique, I just wrapped the rope around the outside of the ear once. So there's just 2 layers of nautical rope on each ear, which left a hollow opening in the ear, which I think is really cute. I glued both ears onto the back side of the bunny, and then to make it easier to glue to the inside of the box, I added 2 pieces of craft stick just to make sure that it was even enough to glue on. Then the last step was just to glue on my little bunny tail, which I just used a white pom-pom for. Now I could start adding my sticks to the inside of the box. So since I only used 5 of the sticks instead of 6, I decided to use 2 of the Agave, 2 of the Ballet Slipper, and 1 of the Maze. And the way that I decided to lay it out is I wanted the 2 Agave sticks to be on the outside, and you can see here I glued those down first because anytime I need to add a little space in between things, I always like to work from the outside to the inside. That way I can adjust the spacing as I need to. So next I put in the Ballet Slipper sticks, and then last was that Maze colored stick that I added to the center. The last step is just to add some hot glue to my bunny and put it in the center of the box. I'm going to use one of these 8x10 canvases to create a little decorative tray. And I did the same thing where I cut the canvas from the frame, but this time I did use a little screwdriver and a pair of pliers to remove all of the staples from the back of the frame. And then I did use my sanding block because this frame for some reason had a lot of rough edges on it. So I'm using these giant craft sticks that you can find at Walmart, and I just measured them to fit the length of the frame. I cut them just a tad short so that they wouldn't stick out from the back. So they're probably cut down maybe 1/8 of an inch shorter than the width of the frame. And I needed 8 sticks altogether to fill in the back of the frame. Once I had everything cut down to size, I took this Plaster Color by Waverly and I gave the frame itself one good coat of paint. And it kind of looks like there's little staples there, but there weren't staples in there. They were just kind of indents. If that's something that it bothers you, you could always fill that in with a little bit of wood filler, but it really didn't bother me. I thought it was kind of a neat little design. Then, because this is for spring, I'm using 3 Waverly colors in Pool, Ballet Slipper, and Cashew. And I guess I forgot to record me actually painting those, but you get the idea. I painted 3 in the blue, 3 in the pink, and 2 in the Cashew color. Then I'm just using the same plaster color that I used to paint the tray, and I'm just dry brushing that on all 8 of the sticks. Once all of the paint had dried, I started hot gluing the sticks onto the back of the frame. And I did them in the same pattern where I went blue, pink, and then, well, the Cashew color, I guess it's kind of yellow. It looks kind of yellow on camera. And I just repeated that the whole way across the back of the frame. And you can see, because these sticks are cut pretty close to the edge of the frame, I didn't feel the need to add any kind of backing to this, because this is just a decorative tray. It's not meant to hold any weight or to be picked up or anything like that. It's just something to look nice. So I took some of this faux leather ribbon that I found at the Dollar Tree, and I had some little brads in my stash, and I used wire cutters to cut off the ends of the brads, and then I used some pliers just to kind of tuck the edges in. And I'm using my ruler here to help me find the center of the frame so that I could glue the ribbon down and have it be the same on both sides. And when I glued the ribbon down, I wanted it to look like a handle. So I glued one edge down, and then I kind of lifted it up with my finger a little bit so it formed a loop, and then I glued the other side down. And then I just hot glued the brads right on top of each edge of the ribbon, just to kind of look like maybe it had been nailed into place. Now that spring is here, I'm really inspired to add more greenery and florals to my home decor, and these planters are a perfect way to do that. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 packs of these bamboo rings. There's 2 different sizes in here. I'm only going to use the smaller one today, but with both packs, you could make 2 different size planters. I'm also using a pack of the craft sticks from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to use a few wooden beads that I already have on hand to act as feet. I wanted to create a base for my bottom ring first. I could have used cardboard here or chipboard or anything just to be able to set a plant on, but I thought since I had this whole pack of craft sticks, I may as well use them up. And the craft sticks were a perfect fit. They fit exactly across the center of these smaller rings. So I just started gluing around the edges of the ring. I started laying my craft sticks on. You can see the one in the middle there. It fit just perfectly from end to end, and then as I worked my way down to one end, it started to overlap, and that was okay, because after I had all of the craft sticks on, I went through with my utility knife and just started cutting off the excess. These craft sticks are pretty thin that you get from the Dollar Tree, so it was pretty easy to cut through these, and I always find that it's easier to make a few light passes rather than trying to cut through the whole stick at once. So I'm just taking my utility knife here and I'm making a few passes just to get the excess off. And remember, this is the bottom of the planter. You're not actually going to be able to see it. I just thought this was a neat way to use up some craft sticks rather than cutting a piece of cardboard. After all the excess was cut off, I did go through with a sanding block and just remove any sharp edges just to make sure that I didn't get any splinters. When I need to cut a bunch of craft sticks down to the same length, I always like to use my paper trimmer. So I'm using those same craft sticks from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting the rounded edge off of one side, and then I'm just measuring out 5 inches and cutting it again so that my planter will be 5 inches tall. Putting this plant holder together was really simple. I just started adding hot glue to the base piece that I had created on the outside of the ring, and I just lined my craft stick up. You can see I have my silicone mat here. This just helps protect my work surface, and it also helps make sure that I can line up the bottom of the craft stick with the bottom of the ring. Once I had a few rings in place, then I went through and I hot glued the other end to the second ring so that I could space these out a little bit more evenly. Once I had a few of the craft sticks hot glued onto one side of my plant holder, I jumped over to the other side because I noticed that it had started to droop, so this just made it a little bit easier to keep it even on both sides. So I'm doing the same thing on this second side here. I'm just adding hot glue to the bottom ring and the top ring, and I'm holding my craft stick in place there. I kept my craft sticks fairly close together. That's the main difference between this one and the one on the Kirkland's website. The Kirkland's ones, the vertical pieces were a little bit farther apart, so it's up to you how you decide to do yours. But I like the look of mine with the craft sticks a little bit closer together. Here's where you can decide what will fit your home's decor the best. For me, I really like the look of the natural wood, but I also like that distressed look. So I'm taking some white chalk paint here, and I'm just dry brushing over the surface, leaving some of that wood show through. You could buy fancier feet for your plant stand, but I'm all about using up what I already have. And since I already had these white wooden beads on hand, I just hot glued these to the bottom. I took one of these carvable foam pumpkins from the Dollar Tree, and you can see there's a little bit of a circle around the top. So I used that as my guide, and I just took my utility knife and I started cutting around that circle. And the inside of these pumpkins are hollow, so I knew this would be perfect for a sort of flower arrangement. Once I had the hole cut out of the top of the pumpkin, I took the plaster color by Waverly, and I had to give this 2 coats because I wasn't going to add anything to the outside of this pumpkin. I just wanted to create a really neutral decor piece. So I needed to use 2 coats of the plaster color to cover up all of that orange. But this is where you could customize it to fit your style. You could paint it any color you wanted, or if you like to use the traditional colors of fall, you could just keep it orange as well. I wanted to create a platform for my pumpkin to sit on, so I took a piece of the square box art from the Dollar Tree, and I just started by removing the little hanger that was on the back, and then I kind of peeled the paper off the front of the box as well. Now the neat thing about this box is it was already painted white around the outside, so I didn't really have to do much around the outside of the box. And I probably could have just given the top of this a coat of paint because I knew I was going to be covering it up anyway, but I decided to, make my life hard and try to get the paper off the top instead. So a little tip I have is I usually use like a little bit of a scraper to start scraping the paper off, but if you wet it a little bit, it's actually a lot easier to kind of peel off whenever it's a little bit damp. So here you can see I got most of the top of the box off using my scraper or my sanding block. So to cover up the top of this box, I decided to use some of these super jumbo craft sticks. So I measured the top of my box, and this one measured about 5 7/8. So I cut all of my craft sticks down to 5 7/8. And then that way I can glue them across the top to give it sort of a shiplap look. Now I got really lucky with this piece of box art because I didn't have to cut any of the sticks down widthwise. I think 6 of them fit perfectly across the top of this box. So I just started by lining one of the sticks up on the edge of the box, and then as I glued each stick down, I just made sure that I pushed it up tight against the stick that I had laid down previously. Like I said before, I got lucky with this box because the sides were already painted white. So to get the top to blend in just a little bit more, I decided to use that same plaster color, and I just did a little bit of dry brushing over the sides of the sticks and across the top. Now, if you're new to crafting, dry brushing is just whenever you dip your brush in paint and then you dab most of it off on a paper towel and go lightly over your surface. And it kind of gives you that distressed sort of brushstroke look. Then all I had to do was add a little bit of hot glue to the bottom of my foam pumpkin and glue it to the center of my platform. I wasn't sure originally if I was going to put a flower arrangement in the center of this pumpkin or if I was just going to stack something else on top of it. So that's why I went ahead and cut the top off first. So I dug around in my stash and I found a bunch of fall greenery that I had purchased at the Dollar Tree. And I decided to start by making sort of a ring of greenery around the top of the pumpkin. So I'm using a little craft stick here and I'm just poking a hole in the foam first because it was a little bit easier that way to get the greenery to lay in there. I didn't want it sticking straight up. I wanted it to kind of lay flat out on the sides, so it was a little bit easier to poke that hole first and then just add a little bit of hot glue and put my greenery through there. After I had all my greenery in place, I decided that I wanted to kind of make a pumpkin topiary. So I had this neutral colored pumpkin in my stash. It came from a flower arrangement, I think from Hobby Lobby maybe a few years ago. But they also sell orange pumpkins at the Dollar Tree that you could use, and I just simply hot glued it right to the top. I wanted to create sort of a minimalist Christmas tree picture. So I was really excited to find these black canvases at the Dollar Tree. And I always like to use these giant craft sticks. So I started by laying out 6 of the giant craft sticks, and I added a little bit of painter's tape to the back side of them just to hold them together so that they were butted right up against each other. Then I used my ruler to find the center of one of the sticks, and then across the bottom stick I measured in about 1.25 inches and I left a little pencil mark, and then I was able to just connect the two dots on each side. So I drew a line then from that top center dot down to one side and then down to the other side, and that's how I was able to achieve my triangle shape for my Christmas tree. So in my mind, it made sense to just cut this like a piece of paper, and I started just going at it with my scissors, and for the most part it worked out okay, but there was one stick that ended up chipping. So I decided to go along with that, and even though it chipped, I went ahead and chipped out a few of the other sticks just to give it more of a rustic look, and that way it all kind of blended together. So probably what would have been easier is to take the tape off, since the pencil marks were already on there, and I could have just cut one stick at a time. Here's that little chip that I was talking about. So I went ahead and decided just to cut a couple more little chips out of the other sticks. And it's kind of hard to see on camera now, but you'll be able to see it later after it's all painted. And I think it's cute. It kind of gave it a little bit more character. Even though I wanted to keep this pretty neutral, I still wanted a little bit of green in my Christmas tree. So the 3 colors I chose are all by Waverly. I chose the mineral, the elephant, and the moss. And I kind of just painted in 2 sticks for each color. So I started at the bottom with the mineral, and then I went to the elephant, and then I went to the moss, and I just repeated that from the bottom to the top. To make my tree look a little more rustic and to make it look like it had snow on it, I decided to use the plaster color by Waverly, and I did a little bit of dry brushing over each of the pieces. And I kind of tried to concentrate some of the color maybe on a corner or on an end. That way it kind of gave that illusion of snow. It was at this point that I realized I forgot to create a trunk for my tree, so I'm just using another piece of the same giant craft stick, and I cut it down to the size that I liked for the trunk, and then I kind of cut some little chips out of that too, and I kind of scraped it with the side of my scissor a little bit just to rough it up a little bit and make it look a little bit more like an actual trunk and not so much just like a craft stick. Then I just gave it one quick coat of the Antique Wax by Waverly, and I used a baby wipe to apply it so that it would have kind of more of a diluted look. It wouldn't be quite so dark as the normal wax color is. Now I needed to assemble my tree. So I used my ruler at the bottom of my canvas just to help me keep everything centered. And because the canvases are stretched over a frame, as I glued each piece down, I had to kind of lift it up and press it from the back just to make sure that that glue really got adhered down. So as I glued each plank of the tree down, I left about, I would say, a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch gap in between each branch, and then that way the black kind of poked through a little bit and it gave it a little bit more of a whimsical look to it. I wanted to give my background kind of a snowy look, so I used an old piece of poster board and I covered up the tree, and I'm using a toothbrush dipped in that plaster color, and I'm just running my thumb along the bristles to create a little bit of a paint spatter. Now the reason I did this after I glued the tree on instead of covering the canvas with the snow first is because I knew I was going to be leaving those gaps in between the wood planks, and I wanted the black in between the wood planks to stay a solid color because I thought that that would help kind of pop out those planks a little bit more. Like, I was afraid if there was snow splatter everywhere that the tree would kind of get lost in it. And then I did have to use a little bit of painter's tape to cover up that stem too. So after I had the snow kind of splattered all over the background, I decided to use my stylus tool in the same color and just add some bigger dots over the background to create kind of like a little bit of differentiation between the different snowballs. And then the last little thing I did for my tree was just to create a simple bow out of some black and white gingham ribbon and hot glue it to the base of the trunk of the tree. I see these Wi-Fi password tag signs at the Dollar Tree all the time. I usually find them in the picture frame aisle. I grabbed 2 of them, plus 2 packs of these wooden cubes and a pack of the giant craft sticks that I get at Walmart. First things first, I added a bead of hot glue to the bottom of one of the signs and glued it to the bottom of the other sign. Then I cut down a piece of the giant craft stick and I hot glued that over the seam for a bit more security. Next, I got to work cutting down my craft sticks. I started by cutting the sticks in half and then cutting the rounded edge off of each stick. I think the final piece was about 4.5, maybe 4 3/8 of an inch long. I started using hot glue to glue my sticks down. This is going to be a tray. So I started at the bottom and I glued the first stick over the seam in the center, and I glued 1 stick on each side. Now, since there is an angle at the end of each of the sides, I took one of the sticks, I held it in place with a piece of painter's tape, then I just used a pencil to draw the line, and I used scissors to cut that angle that I needed, and I kept the other piece that was cut because I was able to flip that over and glue that in place on the other side. Then I moved on to the second row of sticks and I just made sure that I staggered it so that it would create a bricklay pattern. So instead of laying my first stick over the center seam, I made sure that the seam of the 2 sticks on the bottom was in the center of the first stick that I glued in place. And then I just kept repeating that the whole way up until I got to the other end of the sign. When I got to the last row, the sticks that I was using were just a bit too wide, so I did have to cut them down vertically so they could fit, but I just repeated it the same way as if they were the wide sticks. I made sure that I staggered them so that the pattern continued on with that bricklay, and then I cut the angles in as I needed to. I'm keeping my tray simple. I really like the pattern that the sticks provided for this tray, so I'm just using some of the antique wax by Waverly. I'm applying it with a baby wipe so that I'm applying and taking off the excess all in one step. And I also applied that same antique wax to 4 of those wooden cubes as well. Once my stain was all dry, I just needed to glue the wooden cubes on the bottom to act as feet. I did a test run with these first, and whenever I laid the cubes down so that the square ends were flush with the square ends of the tray, if that makes any sense, it kind of made it look like a skateboard. But if I tilted the cubes just slightly, you can see here now that the points face outward, it really changed the look of the whole tray, even though it's just a minor detail. I grabbed 2 of these 6x8 canvas frames from the Dollar Tree, some of the larger craft sticks, and also a bit of the nautical rope to create a really fun and easy lantern. I didn't want the staples showing on this frame, so I grabbed my wire cutters, which is usually the easiest way for me to remove the staples out of these. I think they actually make little tools to remove staples, but I don't have one. Let me know in the comments if you have one and if it works a little bit easier, because sometimes I do struggle a little with these wire cutters. Sometimes I have to get a screwdriver in there too. But I found it easier just to pull the staples out of the canvas and the wood all in one step, rather than cutting the canvas off and then going back through and removing the staples. I grabbed 14 of those craft sticks, and using my paper trimmer, I cut all of them down to 5 inches in length. To create the box for the lantern, I took one of the craft sticks and I hot glued it in the bottom corner of one frame, and then I just hot glued it to the bottom corner of the other frame. Then I took another craft stick and I hot glued it to the 2 top corners of the frame, and I repeated it on the other side. That way I had the base and the top established first before I needed to lay down my other sticks. I spaced out 5 sticks in between the top and the bottom just to give me a quick guide as to where I would need to place them. Anytime I have to space things out like this, when I'm gluing it down, I always go back and forth between the bottom and the top. So you can see I glued down the next to the last on the bottom, then I moved to the top and back and forth. That way, as I'm gluing things down, I can adjust the spacing as I need to make it a little more even. After all the sticks were glued in place on both sides, I got to work on painting my lantern. As much as I love neutral decor pieces, sometimes I really like something with some color, and I love this moss color by Waverly. I've heard from some of you that your Walmarts don't carry the Waverly paint anymore. Mine still does, so I actually bought extra of the colors that I really like, because I'm going to be really sad whenever my Walmart stops carrying this paint. After my paint had dried, I did go back through with a dry brush, and I dry brushed on some white paint just to give it that distressed look. I wanted my lantern to have some handles, so I cut 2 equal lengths of that nautical rope. I tied a knot in each end of the rope as close as I could to the end. The excess rope that was hanging off the end of the knot, I just trimmed as close as I could to the actual knot. I added some hot glue to the center, and then I held it up against the side of the lantern until the glue had cooled down. That way I knew it was set in place, and I repeated that on both sides with both handles. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know that I have quite the collection of wood pieces that I'm trying to work my way through. So I'm using one of the smaller wooden crates from the Dollar Tree. I'm also going to be using 2 different sizes of craft sticks. One are pretty large. I get these at Walmart, and the other ones are just the standard popsicle size craft sticks. And I also have a few little Valentine's Day stickers in my stash that I'm going to use too. I needed to cut these giant wooden craft sticks down to a better size, so I'm using my large paper trimmer here, and my wooden crate measured about 5 inches across. I wanted these craft sticks to be just a bit larger, so I cut those down to 6 inches. I only needed 2 here, and I'm going to stick those next to each other to create a bigger wooden piece. And in order to do that, I'm going to use some painter's tape to hold the 2 pieces together. And the scrap pieces that I cut off of the ends of each of the wooden craft sticks, I'm going to use those to attach the 2 sticks. So I'm just using some hot glue on one of those scrap pieces, and I'm laying it across the seam between the 2 craft sticks that I cut down. And this will hold the 2 pieces together to make it look like one wooden piece rather than 2. Next, I'm giving all of my wooden pieces a coat of red chalk paint. So you can see I have the 2 larger craft sticks that I glued together. I have 2 of the popsicle size craft sticks, and I have that wooden crate, and I painted them all the same color. After my paint was dry, I took my sanding block and I sanded on the edges of all of the wooden pieces, concentrating on the corners and the edges just to give it a slightly distressed look. I created a decal on my Cricut that says Kissing Booth. If you don't have a Cricut, you could use some letter stickers here, or you could just handwrite it. And I laid that on top of those 2 wooden craft sticks that I had glued together. This is going to be the sign that will sit on top of our wooden crate. To get everything assembled, I just hot glued the 2 popsicle sticks on the back side of my kissing booth sign, and then I hot glued that whole piece to the back side of my wooden crate. I had some larger wooden black beads in my stash, and I wanted to hot glue these on the bottom of my kissing booth to look like wheels. After I glued them on, I realized they didn't really look like wheels, so I dug around in my paper craft stash and I got out some black cardstock and some silver glitter cardstock. I have 2 hole punches here. One is an 1.5-inch circle and one is a 1-inch circle, and I just cut 4 of each of those out. I cut 4 of the 1.5-inch on the black cardstock, and then I cut 4 of the silver glitter cardstock in the 1-inch circle, and I layered those on top of each other, and I hot glued those over top of where the wooden beads were, and I felt like it looked more like a wheel than the actual bead did. If you don't have these paper punches in your stash, you can skip this step altogether. I just thought it gave it a really cute touch. Or if you don't have paper punches, you could always look around in your craft room for anything that's round and just trace it onto the cardstock to create your own wheels. Now that my kissing booth cart is all assembled, I went to work decorating it. I have a bunch of stickers in my craft stash because I do love to do paper crafts, so they came in really handy for this. I added some hearts to the wheels, and I had these lip stickers that I added to the sign at the top of the cart, and then I had some felt hearts that I added as an embellishment on the front. You can decorate this however you like, and since this is a kissing booth cart, I thought it would look really cute if I filled it with Hershey Kisses to put out for Valentine's Day. I had been keeping my eye out for these galvanized wall vases from the Dollar Tree, and I was really excited when my store finally got them in. I wanted to jazz it up a little bit so that I could add some sunflowers to it to brighten up my home's decor. In addition to the wall vase, I'm using some of these super jumbo craft sticks from Walmart, a little bit of ribbon, and of course some sunflowers. I started by taking a measurement on the side of the wall vase. I measured in between the 2 lips that ran around the vase, and it measured about 1 7/8 of an inch. Then I took out one of my favorite craft room tools, my paper trimmer, and I started cutting these craft sticks down to that size. Also, just a word of warning, I had a bugger of a time getting the sticker off of the front of this wall vase. I had to use my heat gun, I had to use a scraper tool, and then even after I got all the paper off, there was so much sticky residue on the front that I had to use some rubbing alcohol on the front to get the rest of that residue off. So just a fair warning, and if you are going to use a heat gun to get your label off, just be really careful because that metal heats up really fast. Now that my wall vase is nice and cleaned up, I took the craft sticks that I had cut apart and I just started hot gluing them around the outside. I glued the first one down over the seam in the container, and that was towards the bottom, so it did lift it up more than the other craft sticks, but you couldn't really tell. And I got really lucky because when I got to the end, I didn't have to cut any of the craft sticks lengthwise to fit on there. I was able to leave just a tiny little gap, and they all fit around the outside perfectly. I like the natural color of the craft sticks, but if that isn't your style, you could always paint or stain those. I would just recommend doing that before you glue them around the outside. I also decided to take out the jute rope that they had in the hanger, and I replaced it with some of this black and white gingham ribbon. I filled the inside of the pocket with some smaller pieces of floral foam, and then I just started going to town adding in my favorite pieces of greenery and some of the new fall picks that I found at the Dollar Tree, and of course some sunflowers. Now I wanted some of my florals and flowers to hang down over the front, so that's why I chose not to decorate the front pocket of this wall vase. But if you want to just stick in tiny flowers that poke up through the pocket, I would say you could decorate the front with some stickers or even some really cute window clings. That would be an easy way. I think the window clings would stick right to it. You wouldn't have to Mod Podge them down, or you could just glue on some more flowers or even a big bow. I'm using one of these 8x8 canvases that I got at Michael's, but I wanted to show you that the Dollar Tree also has pieces of wall art that you could use instead. They're just a little bit bigger. So to start, I'm just cutting the canvas off of the frame, but to get started, I just went ahead and cut around the edges, and then I removed as much as I could, and then I went back through and I did remove the staples off of the back of the canvas as well, because I was going to add a backing to this piece, and I knew if the staples were there it would probably sit just a bit uneven. Next, I don't know about you, but when I use craft sticks, I always keep the scraps because I find that they come in handy. And I ended up having quite a few scraps from these giant craft sticks and the super jumbo craft sticks, and they're kind of long, so I decided to try to use them in this project. The first thing I did was I sorted it out by size, and I ended up using just the thinner ones for this project, and using my paper trimmer I took all the rounded edges off of each of the sticks. Then I kind of divided the pile of sticks that I had into 4 equal piles. I wasn't exactly sure how many sticks I would need, and I just started painting the different piles different colors. Now the colors that I picked you could use for summer or for fall, and I wanted kind of an orangey color. I showed you there that I used the pumpkin color by Waverly, but I did add just a little bit of red and a little bit of white to it because it wasn't quite the color that I was looking for. And then after I painted it, I did end up going through and wiping it back off with a baby wipe just because I wanted it to be just a little bit more translucent. So that was the first color that I picked, and then I went ahead and I did the same thing with the antique wax, and then I did some of the sticks with a little bit of dry brushing with the plaster color, and then I did a few of the sticks with the agave color by Waverly too. So this is something that you could customize to fit your own decor. These are just the colors that I picked, but obviously you could use any colors you wanted, or you could even just use 1 color or 2 colors. You don't have to use 4, so this is something neat that you can kind of customize to fit your style. To add a little interest to the background of this piece, instead of just laying the sticks down, I wanted to give it a little bit of extra detail by using a stapler. And I'm showing you here that I have the Tim Holtz tiny attacher, and then I also have a regular stapler too, and you can see the difference in the size between the tiny attacher and a regular stapler. So I decided to use my tiny attacher just because I like the look of the smaller staplers. I think they're really cute. And I'll try to link this in the description box below too if you're interested in finding that for yourself. So to get started, the first stick was pretty easy, and I wanted this to be a diagonal background. So I just took one of the sticks that I had prepared and I laid it in the corner of the frame. And by the way, I did stain this frame with the antique wax as well. So then to create the second row, in order to hold those 2 pieces together, I just used a little bit of Scotch tape on the back of them just to help when I was stapling it. And then I used my tiny attacher, and on some of them I did 2 staples on one side and 1 on the other, and then on some, I doubled up the staples on both sides, so that way it just kind of varied it a little bit, but I think it's a cute little detail for a background like this. And then as I completed each row, I just had to cut a little bit of excess off of the ends so that it would fit inside the frame. So as I was building the rows on this piece, I made sure too that I didn't line any of the seams up. So you can see how there's a seam in the center of that second row. So on the third row, I made sure that I staggered it just a bit so that it's kind of that bricklay pattern where the seams are kind of staggered a little bit. And I did the same thing on each row. I just added a little piece of Scotch tape, and then I used my tiny attacher to add some little staple details on each row. And I wasn't too worried about the color placement. I didn't mind if there was some back-to-back colors or anything like that. I just kind of started grabbing colors at random, and sometimes even on the longer rows when I was using more than 2 sticks, sometimes I would even put in 2 of the same color because I just wanted it to not really have a pattern. I wanted it to be pretty random. So this was pretty fun actually to create these little rows, and I just kept going down the whole frame, and then like I said, I did have to trim some of the edges off just to make sure that it fit within the backing of the frame. To decorate the inside of this frame, I used some of these mini mums that I found at the Dollar Tree, and I just clipped a couple pieces off and wrapped the bottom with some jute twine to make it look like a little mini bouquet, and then I hot glued it into the center of the frame. Now, this picture you could take from fall to summer, or summer to fall rather, pretty easily. You don't really have to do much. You just have to kind of change the decorations that you have around the picture, not the actual picture itself. I wanted to create a little tray, so I'm using 2 of the 8x10 canvases from the Dollar Tree. And again, all I'm doing is running my utility knife around the outside edges and removing most of the canvas. And I usually don't bother removing the staples from the bottom of the canvas. Sometimes if they're sticking up a little bit, I'll take them out, but for the most part, they never seem to get in my way, so I usually don't bother with those. Once I had the canvases removed from both of the 8x10 frames, I just ran a little bit of hot glue around the one frame and stacked the other one on top of it. You could use wood glue here, but I used the Gorilla Glue sticks and I never seem to have any issues with those. They hold up pretty well. So once I had my 2 frames glued together, I used the plaster color by Waverly and I gave it a pretty good coat. I wouldn't say it was a solid coat. I kind of did sort of in between a solid coat and a dry brushing, I guess. To give the frame a little more dimension, I went right back in as soon as I had finished with the plaster color, and I used the truffle color by Waverly, and I used the same brush and I just started dry brushing over it. That way the 2 colors kind of melded together and it gave it a distressed look, but it also kind of helped blend the colors together a bit. And I did that the whole way around the outside and the inside of the 2 frames. To give this tray a little more character, I decided it would be fun to write some coordinates on the front of the tray. So I actually looked up the coordinates for Niagara Falls, New York, because that's actually where my husband and I got married. And I just wrote those on in my own handwriting on the front of the tray with a pencil, and then I went back through with a blue Sharpie and traced over it. And then I sanded everything down really, really well just to make it look a little bit more weathered. To create the bottom of the tray, I'm using these giant craft sticks again, and I just laid them out how I wanted them on the bottom of the tray. I wanted there to be a little bit of space in between, so it kind of looked like slats. And I'm sure you've seen in my other videos that I like to use my paper trimmer to cut down the craft sticks. So once I had how many craft sticks I needed, then I used my trimmer to trim them all down to the same size that would fit on the back of the tray. Once all my sticks were cut to size, I did the same painting technique that I did on the tray. So I gave them a little bit heavier of a dry brush with the plaster color. Then I went through with the truffle color and dry brushed over that, and then I sanded them to blend it all together. And then once all the paint was dry on the sticks, I just hot glued it onto the back of the frame. Since I knew I was leaving gaps in between the sticks, I decided to glue one stick on one end of the frame first, and then I flipped it around and I glued the stick on the other end. That way I was able to space my remaining sticks out between the 2, and it created kind of equal gaps between all of the sticks. I wanted to create a sign that could be carried from Christmas into winter. So for this one, I'm going to use some of these wooden snowflakes, and I'm also using one of the 11 by 14 flat canvases. You can see this isn't a stretch canvas. There's no frame to it, but it is larger than the traditional 8 by 10. And I also created a decal with my Cricut that says, "Let it snow." Unfortunately, when I took the plastic off of my canvas, there were some brown spots on it. So I did go ahead and give mine a coat of white paint, but if you have one that doesn't have any marks on it, you could skip this step. While that was drying, I took 3 of the snowflakes out of the pack, and I wanted to fill in the holes because this is actually an ornament kit. I'm just using some hot glue here. I have my silicone mat laid down, and I ran some hot glue inside of the hole, and then I just used a craft stick to scrape off the excess. After my hot glue was set up, then I went through with some black chalk paint, and I just gave each of my snowflakes one coat. After I laid down the decal that I had made on my Cricut, then I used my fine tip glue gun and I added just a bit of hot glue in the center so that I could lay my 3 snowflakes right on top of my saying. Now I know not everybody has a Cricut, so if you don't, you could try to hand letter this, or you could even find some really cute scrapbook stickers and create your own phrase. Originally, I was going to stop here and just let this be my sign, but it seemed a bit unfinished to me. So I grabbed these giant wooden craft sticks that I get from Walmart, and using my paper trimmer, I cut 4 of them down to 8 inches. I debated what color I should make my craft sticks. I was kind of thinking maybe I should paint them black because I had painted my larger snowflakes black. But then I decided to add a little more color to my sign by just using the Waverly Antique Wax. And you can see here, I'm just applying it with a wet wipe. And I also had some of these smaller wooden snowflakes in a pack from the Dollar Tree. So I gave those a quick coat of the antique wax as well. I'm just using my sticks at the top and bottom of my sign, and since they weren't long enough to go the whole way across, I had to attach 2 of them together. So just for a temporary hold, I flipped them over and I used a piece of clear tape on the back side. Now, they blend in pretty well. You can't really see the seam of that stick, but that's where that little mini snowflake is going to come in to help hide that seam. So along the bottom here, I just ran a bead of hot glue and then I laid my sticks down. And because I cut these down to 8 inches, that gave me 16 inches altogether. And since this is a 14-inch canvas, it gave me 1 inch of overlap on each side. And then I repeated that across the top of the sign as well. You could add more than 1 snowflake across the top, but I like the simplicity of just having 1 at the top and 1 at the bottom. I wanted to create a hanger for my sign, so I hot glued 2 lengths of jute cord together just on the ends to make it easier to string on some beads. I had these black wooden beads in my stash and I thought it would be a great way to coordinate the black snowflakes. So I strung 10 of these beads onto my lengths of jute cord. Then I flipped my sign over, and where those wooden sticks overlapped in the canvas, that was a perfect place to place my hanger. So I added a bead of hot glue and I tucked the jute cord into that little space. And I always like to hold it in place with a piece of tape until the glue has a chance to set. Then I moved over to the other side. I cut off the excess length, added more glue on the opposite side, and did the same thing. Then when it was time to hang, I just moved the beads so that I would have 5 on one side and 5 on the other. I'm taking a jar that I had on hand. I think there was some kind of sauce in this jar. And I measured the height of a jar, and I'm just cutting the sticks down to go slightly above the top of the jar. Next, I'm using a little bit of hot glue, and I'm avoiding the very top of the stick because it is gonna stick out from the lip of the jar just a bit. And I'm just hot gluing these sticks the whole way around the jar. Now my jar took about 10 sticks, and then I did have to take 1 extra stick and I had to cut it down lengthwise just a bit to be able to fit in between the 2 sticks because there wasn't quite big enough of a gap to fit a whole stick in there. But I used my paper trimmer for that also. If you choose to do something like this with a paper trimmer, just be careful though, because it is kind of a narrow piece. So I used an old floral stem to hold it in place so that I didn't get my finger stuck in there. So then once I glued that little stick in there, I wasn't too worried that it was a different size. You can't really tell, and I figured I would just keep it towards the back so you wouldn't be able to notice. So I've been seeing all over YouTube, people are mixing paint with baking powder to kind of create a terracotta look. So I decided to try that on this project, and I'm using the color Mineral by Waverly because that's one of my favorite colors of theirs. So I started out by mixing in some baking powder, and I used way too much baking powder because it got so chunky. So I had to use so much paint in here to thin this out. And in the end, I don't know if I didn't have the ratio right. I'm gonna have to research this a little bit more, but after I got done painting the sticks with this, it just kind of looked like regular chalk paint, even though the paint, look, you can see how thick it is, but for some reason after it dried, it just looked like I had painted it with chalk paint. So I don't know, I'm gonna look around and try to figure out what I did wrong. I still like the look of it. It just, I thought it would have a little bit more texture. Like I thought it would look more like clay than paint, but it's fine. And I actually was inspired to do this piece by something that I saw on Amazon, which I will show you right here. So I was hoping that the paint on the sticks would have had more texture like the picture on Amazon, but like I said, it's fine. I still like it. So I found this burlap ribbon at the Dollar Tree, and I just measured up about 1.25 inches from the bottom and then 1.25 inches from the top of the jar, and I'm just using that as a guide so that there was an even amount of space between the bottom of the jar and the ribbon, and then the top of the jar and the ribbon. And then I just used a little bit of hot glue, and you can see that I'm keeping the seam of the ribbon where that smaller stick is. That way, since that's kind of like the bad side, I can make sure that I keep that on the back. I'm going to use one of these wall shelves that I found at the Dollar Tree and some of these giant craft sticks. Now the wall shelf is about 3.5 inches wide, so I'm cutting my craft sticks down to the same length, 3.5 inches. Next, I decided to double up the craft stick, so I just ran a little bit of hot glue along the length of each craft stick, and I just sandwiched one on top of the other. That way it gave it a little bit more texture, and it made it just a little bit thicker so it would be a little bit sturdier when it was hanging. Now to create the hanging part of the shelf, I'm using some of this thinner jute twine from the Dollar Tree. And all I did was I left a little bit of a tail on the one end, probably about 18 inches or so. And I ran my hot glue along the bottom of one of the craft stick bundles. And then I wrapped it around and glued it again. So that way you'll have 2 lengths of the jute on one side of the sticks and just 1 length on the other side. So you can see here, now that I'm on the second stick, I laid the jute over it with some hot glue, then I wrapped it around and put a little bit more hot glue on it again and stuck it in place. And I'll zoom in here in a second so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. So you can see I just added a little bit of hot glue, and I laid the jute on it, and I left a little bit of gap in between each of the craft sticks, and then wrapped the twine around and put it back on top. So that way, like I said, you'll always have 2 lengths of jute on one side of the craft sticks, and then you'll just have 1 length on the back side. And I used about 17 bundles for my shelf. That was just the length that I thought looked good, but depending on how low you want your, I don't know what to call it, the suspension bridge to hang, you could use more or less bundles. And then once I had all of the bundles put in place on one side, then I went back through and I did the same technique on the opposite side. And then that made it really sturdy too. And it left just the little bit of gap between each one, so it made it nice and flexible whenever I hung it off of the shelf. Now to attach the hanging part to the wall shelf, I took the tails of that jute and I ran just a tiny bit of hot glue on the ends, and then I kind of let it cool for a second and I rolled it in between my fingers. That way it made it a little bit easier to fish through from the bottom of the shelf. Now these shelves already come assembled, like they already had those ropes and everything knotted on the bottom, so I just had to weave my 2 little tails up through each of the holes, and then I just did a double knot on the top, and then after I had that part secured in place, I flipped it over and I added just a little bit of hot glue underneath, and then I tied my knot into the hot glue, so that way it was nice and secure. It had 2 knots on it, on the top and the bottom, and then the bottom had just a little bit of hot glue just to help make it a little bit more sturdy, because that hanging part, you can put things on it, so I wanted to make sure that it could bear some weight. And then I just repeated that on the opposite side as well. Now I think this looks cool the way it is, but I wanted to decorate it up just a little bit more, so I took one of these neat little throw rugs that you can find at the Dollar Tree, and I decided just to cut the fringy trim end of it off. And both of the sides have a rolled seam on them, so I ended up actually cutting one bundle of fringe off of each end. That way it took care of that bulky part. And then I was able to just hot glue it along the front of my shelf. And then I went back through, and all those little straggly strings that are sticking up, I trimmed those off just to make it look a little bit cleaner. I wanted to create a fun little box that I could put a floral arrangement in for the spring. So I'm using one of these wooden crates that you can find at the Dollar Tree. And I started out by measuring the craft sticks down to 7.5 inches. And I'm using my miter shears to cut these. Then I took my favorite antique wax by Waverly, and I wanted to stain all of the pieces. And I'm also going to be using a 6-inch dowel also from the Dollar Tree. So I just did a typical staining here. I just painted on the antique wax, and then I used a paper towel to wipe off the excess. Sometimes I like to use a baby white, but I knew that I wanted this stain to stay just a bit darker, so that's why I chose to use a paper towel this time instead of a baby wipe. And I did the same thing on all of the 4 pieces. I just painted on the stain and then wiped it off with a paper towel. Once all of the pieces had dried, I just took the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I'm just dry brushing all over the pieces because I wanted it to kind of have that whitewash distress look. And I made sure to do the front and the backs of the craft sticks because both sides are going to show. Then to assemble the box, all I'm going to do is put a little bit of hot glue above and below the little hole that's in the side of the crate, and I'm just going to attach each craft stick to the sides of the box. That way, once the dowel rod is in place, it'll kind of give it that old tool caddy look, and it kind of makes it look like it has a handle on the top. But the dowel rod is just a bit too big, so I had to use my pencil to mark it. And then the nice thing about these miter shears is they cut really easily through dowel rods like this. If that's something that you are interested in, I do have that linked in the description box below. And then I just used a little bit of hot glue, and I hot glued that in between the 2 craft sticks. Now, if you're worried that somebody might try to pick this up, you probably would want to use wood glue here, but I knew nobody in my house would try to actually pick it up by the handle, so I felt okay just using the hot glue. Then to fill the basket, I just cut a piece of floral foam down to size, and then I took a couple of these greenery bouquets from the Dollar Tree and started filling it in. I sometimes struggle with floral arranging, but for me, the easiest way that I know how to do it is I try to keep longer pieces towards the back, and then I kind of stagger them down as I get to the front. So I'll put like longer pieces in the back, then medium-sized pieces, and then the smallest pieces towards the front. And then anywhere that there was still some floral foam showing, I just tucked in a few extra pieces of greenery. Then just to give this box a little finishing touch, I'm using this stylus tool from the Dollar Tree, and I'm using the chalk paint by Waverly called Elephant, and I'm just adding little dots to make it look like the planks were nailed into the side of the crate. The Dollar Tree has these really cute watermelon tablecloths out right now, and I love the design of them. I love that the watermelons look like they're made of watercolor, and because these are so big, you can see this one's an oval 52 by 70 inch. There's a lot of watermelons on there that I could use for different projects. I wanted to make a simple set of coasters to use this summer, so in addition to that tablecloth, I'm going to be using some of the tumbling tower blocks and some of these jumbo craft sticks. I've made coasters similar to this before on my channel, and they're really fun and they're really easy to put together. Each coaster needs 6 of the tumbling tower blocks, and you can see here I'm just using some hot glue to glue 2 of them end to end, and I'll need 3 groups of those for each coaster. I got to work on cutting down my craft sticks. The tumbling tower blocks, when you glue 2 of them together, it equals almost 4 inches, and since I wanted my coasters to be a square, I cut down all of my craft sticks to about 4 inches as well. And for each of my coasters, I'm going to lay 4 sticks on the top and 4 sticks on the bottom, so I needed 8 sticks for each coaster altogether. Assembling the coasters is pretty easy. I started by laying out one of the craft sticks that I had cut down, and on the one end I glued down one of my bundles of tumbling tower blocks, and then I did the same on the other end, and then I was able to eyeball where the middle set of tumbling tower blocks could go. Then after I had those 3 in place, I could just flip it over and glue down my other 4 sticks on the top, and then glue the 4 sticks on the bottom as well. Once everything is glued in place, you can see the little coaster looks like a mini palette. You can decide if you want to paint yours or not. I decided to leave mine with just the natural wood. As a decoration for each of my coasters, I took that tablecloth and I cut out 4 of the pieces of watermelon that were all over it, and then I used a small amount of Mod Podge to adhere it to the top of the coaster, and then I also gave the entire coaster on the surface, on the top surface, another coat of the Mod Podge just to help waterproof it a little bit. I'm always impressed with the picture frame selection they have at the Dollar Tree, and you can grab some of these frames and use them for things besides showing off your photos. I grabbed 2 frames that I liked, and I'm also using some of these super jumbo craft sticks that I get at Walmart. I already took the insides out of the frames, and I'm removing the prongs from the back side as well. Depending on what frames you choose will decide how many sticks you'll need for your pumpkin. For my frames, I lined up 7 sticks on the inside of my frames, and I left a small gap in between each of the sticks, and you can see that the sticks are just a tad too long for this frame, so I just cut a little excess off of one end of each of the sticks. Originally, I wanted to paint my sticks with the elephant color, but unfortunately mine was just about empty and I didn't have enough to paint all 14 sticks. So instead, I took the mineral color, I added just a dot of the ink color, and I mixed this together. And the gray was a little darker than the elephant color, but it did the trick. I'm also adding that same color to 4 of the tumbling tower blocks. To make the frames and the sticks more cohesive, I decided to take that same paint mixture and I did a heavy dry brushing over both of my frames. Once all my gray paint was dry, I took the plaster color by Waverly and I did a heavy dry brushing on all of the pieces. So I dry brushed over the sticks, the Jenga blocks, and the 2 picture frames. After the paint was dry, I started laying my sticks back down onto the picture frame. So this is the back side of the picture frame you're seeing here, and I always like to start by gluing the bottom stick in place first, then I flip over and I glue the top stick in, and then I just go back and forth. I glue the bottom one, then I go back to the top, and then that way I can kind of judge how the spacing needs to be as I'm laying them out. So if I need to adjust the spacing, I can do that and it'll look pretty even as I make my way from one side to the next. And I did that on the back side of both of my frames. After all my sticks were in place, I took the tumbling tower blocks and I hot glued 1 into each corner of the bottom picture frame. Once those were all in place, then I added more hot glue to the tops of the tumbling tower blocks and I laid the second frame down on top. For the stem of this pumpkin, I took a piece of dark brown felt out of my stash. I cut a strip about 3 inches wide. I hot glued down a piece of an old floral stem and I rolled it from one end to the other. When I got to the end of the piece of felt, I added more hot glue to secure it in place. After my hot glue had set up for a few seconds, I grabbed the piece out of the center and I started twisting and pulling it up through, and it created a cone-shaped stem. I added hot glue to the inside of the 2 frames and I placed the stem inside. Then I got to work decorating the front of the pumpkin. Since this pumpkin's a little bit bigger, I decided to get out some of the bigger leaves and greenery that I had. I laid them over the front and I also tucked a few into the top of the frame around the stem to blend everything together. I created a simple bow for the front by cutting 2 pieces of burlap ribbon that were the same length. I folded them in half and I cut from the outside towards the center to dovetail both of the ends. Once they were all cut, I laid them in an X pattern and I cinched them together and tied them in the center with a piece of jute. I also decided to wrap a few pieces of this berry garland around my bow, and I wrapped it around a pencil to create those cute little corkscrews. I hot glued the bow to the top of the pumpkin, and I grabbed a pack of these fairy lights that you can find at the Dollar Tree. I started by adding them into the bottom of the pumpkin, and I used my pencil if I needed to help pull them up through to the top, and I made sure that I left the battery pack out on the bottom and stuck it towards the back of the pumpkin so you couldn't see it once it was all lit. I took a pack of these craft sticks from the Dollar Tree, and these are the tongue depressor size sticks, not the popsicle size sticks. And I'm using the Antique Wax by Waverly, and I just always like to brush this on and then wipe it off with either a paper towel or a baby wipe, depending on what kind of color I want. If I want it a little bit darker, I usually use a paper towel, and if I want it a little bit lighter, I use a baby wipe. Once I think I stained about 10 sticks altogether. So once I had them all stained, I cut them down into 2.5-inch pieces. So that left me with about 20 pieces, and I don't think I quite used all of them. So I laid my silicone mat down and I just started hot gluing the sticks onto the wreath form. And I did overlap the sticks just slightly, maybe about 1/4 inch. And I just repeated that process the whole way around the wreath form. And then once I had all of the sticks in place, I flipped it over and I ran hot glue all along the back side of it just to reinforce it a little bit more. They have these little home signs at the Dollar Tree, and I liked it how it was, but the frame itself was just a little bit too neat for my taste because I wanted this to have just a little bit more of a rustic look. So I just used my sanding block and I roughed it up pretty good around the edges, and then I used the antique wax again and I brushed it on and wiped it off. But because this frame is actually covered in kind of like a plasticky paper material, I'm not really sure what it is, the antique wax actually only grabbed onto the parts that I had sanded off. But I really liked how it looked then. It just kind of roughed it up just a bit more. And then to be able to attach this to the wreath, I took 4 lengths of jute and I hot glued a piece in each corner. So I laid a little bit of hot glue down and I put the jute on the corner, and then I put more hot glue over top because I really wanted this to be secure. And then those are the pieces that I'll be able to use to tie it right onto the wreath form. And then if you were lucky enough to grab a few extra of these floral garlands in the fall, I decided this would look really cute wrapped around the outside edge of this. But I do like how it looks without this floral garland. But I know this isn't available right now in the store, but if you have something like that on hand, you could use something like that. And then I was able to just tie that sign into place. And once I had all 4 pieces tied on, I did add just a little bit more hot glue on the back just to make it extra secure. Wooden trays are a great way to display some of the things you have for the different holidays and seasons. I grabbed this wooden tray from a Dollar Tree that had a plus section. It was only $3 and it was a pretty good size. I started by measuring the inside of the tray from the inside of each of the frames, and then I got to work cutting down the giant craft sticks. Once I had enough sticks cut for the inside of my tray, then I moved on to the next step. Because this wooden tray had such a nice wood grain pattern to it, I didn't want to paint over it, but I did want to stain it, but I wanted to keep it with the Valentine's theme. So I took a small bowl of water and I'm adding to it some pink chalk paint and some red chalk paint to get the color that I liked. And once I applied it to the tray, it really helped show off that wood grain, but it also gave it a nice tint for Valentine's Day. I worked in small sections across the tray. I applied the stain that I created with the paintbrush, and then I'm using some wet wipes to wipe off the excess. I didn't paint too much of a section at one time because I didn't want the paint to start drying before I had a chance to wipe it off. So I just worked in little batches until I had the whole tray covered in the stain. While my tray was drying, I grabbed some white chalk paint and I started painting all of my craft sticks. You can see here that I cut all of these craft sticks down to the right width, and then there's one smaller craft stick there that I had to cut lengthwise because it needed to be a little bit smaller so that it would all fit inside of the tray. Now that all of my paint is dry, I can start adding the sticks to the bottom of the tray. I started on one side and I'm just using hot glue, and I'm hot gluing all of the sticks side by side. I'm pushing them pretty tight up against each other. I don't really want any gaps in between the two sticks. And the smaller stick that I had to cut lengthwise, I decided to tuck that into one of the ends rather than putting it in the middle so that you wouldn't be able to see it as much. I think the tray looks cute just like this, but I decided to add one more embellishment to mine. I had some of these wooden hearts in my stash. I grabbed 4 of them, and using a gold paint pen, I gave them a quick coat of the gold paint. Then I used a white chalk marker and I spelled out the word love across 4 of the hearts, and I hot glued them onto the side of the tray. The Dollar Tree always has versions of these gift boxes. So I took 3 of the Hexagon boxes and I gave them 2 coats of this Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte White paint. And these are the jumbo craft sticks that I get from Walmart. And you can see they're a little bit bigger than the tongue depressor size sticks. So for the lids of the box, I just measured the sides and I cut my craft sticks down for each of the 3 sizes. And I knew I would need 6 sticks for each of the lids. So once I had all of my craft sticks cut down to fit around the edges of the lids, then all I had to do was simply hot glue them around the sides. And I did that for all 3 lids. Now you could leave the craft sticks just how they are, but I decided to take a little bit of the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I'm just doing a dry brushing technique, and I'm just kind of dry brushing it around the sticks there because I think it just made the sticks stand out just a little bit less, which was kind of the look that I was going for. And again, I did that on all 3 of the lids. So for the box part, I'm using some of this nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, and it is 3 ropes wound into 1 rope. So I just unwound it a bit, so I was just using 1 strand of the rope, and I'm gluing that around the top of the box part. And this rope, because it was woven together, it is a little bit curly whenever you pull it apart. So you just have to keep the tension on it whenever you're gluing it around the top of the box. Because of the little waves in the rope. You just want to make sure you pull it tight before you actually stick it down. Once I had the rope on all 3 of the boxes, then I just used a little bit of hot glue on the bottom of the box and I just glued it back inside of the lid. That way there was a little bit of trim on the back side and the rope was on the front. And I think these are so cute. And if I get some bigger clay pots, I'm going to put those inside the bigger too. But you could actually even use sawtooth hangers on the back of these if you wanted to hang them up and use them as little like shadow boxes on your wall too. I like the simplicity of this framed print from Kirkland's, and I knew with a few items I could give it more character and more texture. I found this really large frame at the thrift store. This measures about 16 inches by 26 inches. I liked that it has an inset in the middle and there was no glass for me to deal with. I started by giving that inset portion a thick coat of green chalk paint. While that was drying, I grabbed a pack of these giant craft sticks and a pack of the super jumbo craft sticks. Both of these I get at Walmart. You can see the size difference here, and both of them are much larger than the typical tongue depressor size craft stick. If you're using a smaller frame, you could definitely use some of the smaller craft sticks to get the same look, but because my frame was pretty large, I stuck with the bigger craft sticks. I also laid my cutting mat out, and I laid a piece of blue tape where the width of my frame would be. So that would give me a guide as I'm laying out my craft sticks about how big the surface was that I had to work with. I started with the giant craft sticks first. These are the bigger of the two craft sticks, and I always like to use my paper trimmer anytime I'm cutting down craft sticks because it just gives me the most even cut. I really can't give you many measurements here because depending on what size frame you use, you'll have to use your judgment as to what size you need to cut your craft sticks down to. I started with the largest ones. I cut a bunch of them, and I started laying my craft sticks down under my paper trimmer on the surface that I had taped out. If you don't have a big cutting mat like I do, you could just measure out the surface you're working with and lay out a little box using some painter's tape just so you have an idea of how many sticks you're actually going to need to cut down. And then that way you're not gluing them as you're cutting them, so you can play around with the layout. I used the Kirkland's photo as my inspiration for most of the layout. I did have to add in a bit at the bottom. So once I had some of my craft sticks cut, then I started laying them out on my craft mat there, giving me an idea of how many sticks I would need and what lengths I would need to cut them to. And because they were down there on my work surface, I was able to just cut a few sticks at a time, work on the layout as I liked it, go back, use my paper trimmer, cut a bit more craft sticks, and it gave me a better idea of the spacing that I would need for each section of my craft sticks. And I did try to, as I was working through the different sections of the craft sticks, I tried to make sure that they were going in different directions, and I was using both sizes of craft sticks so that I wouldn't have all of the big ones on one side and all of the small ones on one side. It kind of gave it more character and more texture the more that I variated the sizes and the directions of the craft sticks. Once I had the pattern all laid out how I liked it, then I went through with some white chalk paint and I just dry brushed all over the surface of each of the craft sticks. I didn't mind if a little paint got on my cutting mat, so it was easier to do it this way, just to pick up each stick individually, do my dry brushing, and lay it back down where it belonged. That way I didn't lose where my pattern was going to be. If you're worried about getting paint on whatever surface you're using, I would just lay out your pattern how you like it and then take a picture of it so that you can refer back to it so that you know where you need to lay each stick on your picture frame. Now that all of my sticks have been cut and dry brushed, I could reassemble my photo frame. I started by gathering up each pile of sticks according to size, and I laid the pile of sticks down on my surface in the direction that they needed to go. Once all of my sticks were laid back down in their pattern, then I started using some hot glue to glue everything in place. For each group of sticks, I would start at one end, hot glue that end stick down first, then I would move to the other end of the group and glue that stick in place. Then the sticks that were in the middle of the group, I would glue down from each end working towards the middle. That way I could adjust the gaps of the sticks as I was working towards the middle. I didn't mind if the gaps weren't exactly the same throughout the sticks because I did like that there would be a little more green showing through some of the sticks, and it did give it more texture that way. I really like how this piece turned out. I'm always looking for ways to create bigger pieces of decor. Sometimes I think, you know, as crafters, we kind of get stuck in a rut where we feel like we're making the same things over and over again. So it was really fun for me to go to the thrift store and find this frame. It was perfect for what I needed it for, and I'm really glad to have a nice big piece of home decor in my home now. Another type of frame canvas they have at the Dollar Tree is usually in the photo frame section. They usually have these square pieces of wall art, and I like these because you can't find a square frame in the Crafter Square section. Now, the wood inside these frames is not real wood, it's kind of that particle board MDF, but that's okay, we can make it work. In addition to 4 of those, I also grabbed 4 of the 5x7 canvas frames, some thicker jute cord, a few of these mini clothespins that I already had in my stash, and a few of these cork sheets that you can also find at the Dollar Tree. After I had removed the canvas from all 8 of the frames, I got to work on painting and staining. I used some white chalk paint and I gave a medium coat to these MDF frames, and you can see because of the color that they are and the texture that they have, it really does look like distressed wood once you apply that paint. Since the 5x7 frames are made of real wood, I decided to use a baby wipe to apply the antique wax to all 4 of those frames. And after I had given them a good coat, I moved on to the craft sticks and I did the same technique where I used the baby wipe to apply the antique wax. I needed a backing piece for the smaller 5x7 frames. I took some regular corrugated cardboard from a package that I had gotten in the mail, and I cut it down to roughly the same width as the frame. Once I measured out the frame, I did go back through and I took about 1/4 of an inch off the length and the width just to make sure that it would fit behind the frame and you wouldn't see the cardboard showing through. After I had all the pieces cut for the frames, then I went back through with those cork sheets and I did the same thing. I just traced the cardboard onto the cork sheet, cut it out, and because these are self-adhesive, I was able to just peel the backing off and stick it to the cardboard. Before attaching the back to the frame, I took some of that thicker jute cord and I laid it out so that it was just a little bit wider than the backing itself. Then I wrapped it around. I left a little slack in the line and I attached it with some hot glue and some clear tape just to make sure that it was really held in place. I wanted the line a little slack so that I could either add a mini clothespin to clip a photo to it, or I could tuck a photo down behind the cord as well. I turned the square frame so that it became a diamond shape, and I centered the smaller frame in the middle. I used some hot glue to hold everything in place, and I repeated that with the other 4 frames as well. I took those craft sticks that I had stained earlier and I cut them down to 2.5-inch pieces. I got 2 pieces from each of the craft sticks, so now instead of 4 I have 8, which is what I need to attach all of the frames together. I started by laying 2 of the frames next to each other, and I used my ruler to make sure that the gap between the 2 frames was the same at the top and the bottom. And then because this ruler does have measurements going in the other direction, I was able to line that up so that I knew where I needed to put my hot glue. I laid my hot glue down and then laid the craft stick on top of it, and then I repeated the same thing on the bottom. Because there's measurements on that ruler, I was able to set my ruler down so I had a guide as to where I needed to put that craft stick. So I glued these 2 frames together and then I repeated the same thing on the other 2 frames. I laid out both sets of frames that I had glued together with the craft sticks, and then I used my remaining craft sticks to glue in the opposite direction. So essentially I just formed a big square with all 4 frames, but I'm actually going to hang it as a diamond shape. Now that all the frames are attached, I could start placing in photos and other little things. One of the pieces of wall art that I took off of the square frame had this really pretty piece of greenery on it, and I thought it would look really cute clipped into one of the frames. So I cut it out, and then I used my little picker tool and I started pulling out some of the threads just so that it would have a frayed edge, and I used a mini clothespin to attach it to one of the frames. I also gathered up a few pieces of greenery that I had in my stash. I hot glued them together and I used a clothespin to clip it into one of the other frames. And then for the last 2 frames, I just tucked in 2 pictures of my dogs. For this DIY, I'm using one of these chunky conversation hearts, but I'm only using it as a pattern. I'm also going to use one of the 8x10 stretch canvases from the Dollar Tree, but I'm not going to use the material. I'm only using the frame. And I also have these giant wooden craft sticks that I get from Walmart. They're much bigger than the typical craft stick, but they're perfect for this project. I'm starting by removing the canvas from the frame. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I usually just take my utility knife, run it around the edges to get most of the extra material off, and then if there's any loose staples, I'll go back through with a pair of wire cutters and lift those out also. I always hang on to this material because I always find other projects that I can use it for. Wow. I've been using this same paper trimmer to cut craft sticks for almost 4 years now, and the blade is still nice and sharp. I haven't had any issues with it. For my craft sticks, I'm cutting these down to about 7.5 inches, and I needed 8 of them altogether. I do have a piece of chipboard here that I cut down to 7.5 by 9.5 inches so that it would fit just inside the frame. I'm taking my craft sticks, and I did have to overlap the chipboard just a bit with the first one so that all 8 of them would fit across the chipboard. But you can see here, they're the same width as the backer that I created. So I'm just using my hot glue, and I'm laying my sticks down one by one, and I'm pressing them together fairly tightly because they fit pretty perfect on the surface that I had. I'm using a wet wipe here to apply the Waverly Antique Wax to the craft sticks that I formed into the backer, and I'm also using the same technique to stain my frame. I really like using the wet wipe to apply and take off the excess because it really helps bring out the natural wood grain in stuff like craft sticks and wooden frames. I made sure that the antique wax was really dry before I moved on to this step. So I laid that heart down on my backer. It's hard to see on camera, but I did trace it out with a pencil. So if you didn't have one of these wooden hearts, you could just use a piece of paper and make a heart pattern. It's just that I already had this one on hand and it fit really well inside that frame, so I knew it would be a great size for this project. After I had the heart all traced out, then I went in with some white chalk paint, and I just really took my time making sure that I got that paint right up against that pencil line so that the wood grain would only show through where the heart was. I went through and I did the whole outline of the heart, and I would pull the excess paint downward with my paintbrush so that it didn't have a buildup of paint right next to the pencil line. I did find that this worked out a little bit easier for me with the brush that I used. You can see it's a little bit wide and the bristles really come to a finer point, so it was a lot easier for me to trace that pencil line with this type of paintbrush. Once I had the whole heart traced out, then I went through with the same paintbrush and I started applying white paint all over, and I didn't mind if some of the wood grain showed through the paint because I do like that distressed look. Now I'm using white chalk paint here, but if you want to add a little bit more color to your decor, you could certainly use any type of Valentine color that you like. Like I mentioned, I really like the distressed look, so after my white paint had a chance to dry, I did go through with my sanding block and I gave it a light sanding just to help blend the two colors together and let some more of that antique wax show through the white. Then I went through with a baby wipe again and I wiped everything off because it does get really dusty and I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any dust left on there. To finish off this DIY, I just laid a bead of hot glue all around the back side of the frame, and then I was able to stick my backer right on. I saw these square-shaped mini bowls at the Dollar Tree, and when I saw them, I knew right away that I wanted to turn these into succulent planters or bud vases, and there's 6 in a pack, so I think that's a pretty good deal. So along with those dishes, I'm also going to use some of the tumbling tower blocks and some of these giant craft sticks from Walmart. If you don't have those things, you could buy 2 of these pallets at the Dollar Tree and you could save yourself a lot of steps, but I only had 1, so I had to create my own. I started with 7 of the Link tower blocks. Actually, I used 14. I'm going to glue 7 together in a row, and I'm going to do 2 rows of that. So for this project, I decided to try some wood glue. A lot of times I just use the Gorilla Glue the hot glue sticks, but there is going to be a little weight to this project, so I thought the wood glue would give me a better long-term hold. And you can see here, I'm just using my square to help line everything up, and like I said, I glued 7 in a row and I made 2 rows of 7. While the wood glue was setting up on my tumbling tower blocks, I got to work on cutting down my craft sticks. So I took 9 of the craft sticks and I cut these all down to 5 inches in length. And at this point, the wood glue was still not set up, so I got to work on decorating these little mini square dishes. I had this burlap trim on hand from the Dollar Tree. I think I got it last year, but I believe I've seen it there recently. And I wanted the cup to be mostly clear. I really wanted to be able to see through it, but I didn't like that little lip on the bottom, so that's why I decided to take this trim and just run a piece around the bottom of 3 of the cups. After my wood glue had dried, then it was time to start assembling this little mini pallet ladder type of thing. So I used my square ruler again, and I put both sets of my tumbling tower blocks on the square just to keep them even, and I pre-laid out the craft sticks just to get a good idea of the spacing that I would need in between each craft stick. And anytime that I do something like this where I have to space things out, I always glue the bottom one first, and then I go back through and I glue the top one down. That way it kind of stabilizes the piece, and then I can go back and forth. So now I'll go back to the bottom one and glue the next one to the bottom, and then I'll go back up and glue the next one to the top, and I just keep going back and forth like that until I get to the middle. And then that way it helps me judge when I need to add a little more space in between one of the sticks or when I need to make it a little smaller. After everything was set up, then I went in with some paint and I decided to give this a pretty heavy dry brushing. I wouldn't say I gave it a full coat. I wanted some of that wood grain to show through, and of course I'm using the Plaster Color by Waverly because you all know that's my favorite color. But this is definitely something you could customize to fit your style if you wanted to paint it a nice big bold color, or you could even stain it and really show off the wood grain of the craft sticks. I wanted to add the rope hanger before I finished this project, and there was a nice little space on the back side where a rope would tuck in nicely. This rope I actually got from Amazon. It's not the nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, but you could definitely use that too. I just like this one because it's a little thinner than the nautical rope, and you can see it just tucked up against those tumbling tower blocks, and then I added a bunch of glue on top just to make sure it was secure. Now I was ready to start adding in the cups, so I laid them out first just to get an idea of how I wanted them spaced out, and I also put them on an angle just to make it more interesting. And I'm using this Fix-All adhesive from the Dollar Tree, which is very similar to the E6000 glue. And I added a little dab on the back, and I knew I would be able, you could see it through the cup, but that was okay because I was going to be filling the cups up anyway, and I knew I would be able to cover up the little blob that you would see. But because these are plastic, I figured the Fix-All adhesive would adhere a little better to the plastic than just using hot glue. I decided to keep the decorating simple for mine, so I added some river rock to each cup, and then I added one clip of a sprig of flowers to each cup also. But another idea I had was, if you are a beach goer, you could collect sand from your favorite beaches and fill the cups with sand from the beaches and add some seashells for a nautical look. I really like the look of this wood bead lantern on the Kirkland's website, and even though it's on sale right now for $11.99, originally it was selling for $19.99. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 of the stretch canvases that measure 6 6 inches by 8 inches. I'm also going to use a few of the regular size craft sticks and some white wooden beads that I already had in my stash. I started by prepping my canvases. I don't need the canvas material for this project, but I always like to hang on to it in case I need it later on. I'm just using a stapler remover here to remove the staples off the back side. If you didn't want to mess around with taking out the staples, you could just cut the canvas away. The staples would be towards the inside of the lantern anyway, so they wouldn't show up too much. Then I got to work on cutting down my craft sticks. I always like to use my paper trimmer for this, and I always do have this linked in the description box below. I just think it's an easier way to make sure that all of your cuts are even, and I cut all of my sticks down to 5 inches. You may have seen my hand fly up on the screen there. That's how I leave myself notes sometimes when I'm recording as I craft, so that I don't forget how short I need to cut something down to, or how many of something that I need. So next I moved on to the painting. I'm using some white chalk paint here, and I'm giving both of my frames and all 4 of my craft sticks a quick coat of the chalk paint. I'm not too worried if some of the wood shows through, because I do like that distressed look, and the wooden beads that I'm using are already white, but they do have a distressing on them as well, so I figured that it would just go together if I left a little of that wood show through the paint. While those pieces are drying, I moved on to my wooden beads. I have a pair of these miter shears. I do have these linked in the description box also. They're really handy for cutting through things like beads or wooden dowels, or even the Jenga blocks from the Dollar Tree. I've cut through those already too. It just makes it a lot easier. And there is a little plate on it. If you need to cut an angle, you can switch it up to whatever angle you need. But for the beads, I just needed to cut those in half. So you can see I'm laying these beads right in the channel that's on the middle of the miter shears, and then I just close the bead or the blade down on top of it, and I'm cutting right through that hole rather than cutting the other way. Now, I know on Amazon you can find half round wood beads already cut like this, but since I had these white ones in my stash, I figured I'd use up what I had. And I also wanted to show too that after the front sides of my frames and my sticks dried, I did flip them over and give the other side a coat of paint too, since you would be able to see that a bit through the lantern. Now that everything's nice and dry, I could start assembling my lantern. I took one of my craft sticks and I applied just a small amount of hot glue to the bottom corner of the first frame. And then I took the other frame and I laid it down on the opposite side of the craft stick. So I'm just going to use 2 craft sticks on each side of the frames to hold them together, because I wanted the sides to be nice and open so that you could see through it. So now that I have the bottom stick in place, I'm going to move to the top, and I just did the same thing. I applied some hot glue and I laid that craft stick right over the one frame, and then I added hot glue and glued it down to the other side, and then I repeated that on the opposite side of the frames as well. And it might be a little tricky to see here, but I did leave the sides of the frames that had the staples on it towards the center of the lantern. But like I said, if you didn't feel like messing around with taking out those staples, I think you could have left them in and just painted right over it, and you probably wouldn't even notice them. The Kirkland's lantern had beads going the whole way around the top and the bottom, but I really wasn't sure that I'd have enough beads to do that, so I decided just to stick with the parts that had the craft stick. So you can see here, I'm just adding a little bit of hot glue to the underside of my half bead, and I'm laying it down on top of that craft stick that goes around the bottom of my lantern. Then I moved to the top side of the lantern and I added the half beads to the top part, and once I had both sides done where the craft sticks were, I realized I didn't have enough beads, so I didn't put them on the actual frames. I only added it to the craft sticks. But if you have enough beads, you could go the whole way around and it would look just as good. Now, you might have also seen in the Kirkland's picture that it did have a handle, but I really liked how this looked just nice and open like this. So I decided not to add a handle to mine, but there's a lot of ways you could do that. You could use a piece of wire and run it from one side to the other going across the top, or you could even tie on some jute rope or some nautical rope and give it 2 handles on each side. Now, the last thing that I wanted to do for my lantern was add some feet, and I did have a few white wooden beads that were a bit larger, so I just used some hot glue in each corner and added a bead on to act as a foot. One of my favorite things to grab at the Dollar Tree are these small wooden trays. I also grabbed a pack of the giant craft sticks from Walmart, and I'm going to use a few pieces of greenery and a few Easter eggs for this centerpiece as well. I also grabbed a glass. This is just from the regular glassware section, but you could use any type of container or candle holder. I started by using some hot glue, and I added some to the top of one container and I glued them together. Next, I took my giant craft sticks and I measured how far up I wanted them from the top of the container. For these ones, I was able to actually just cut these giant craft sticks right in half. They're about 10 inches long. So I made sure that I cut each one down at the 5-inch mark. And you always know that I love to use my paper trimmer to cut my craft sticks because it just makes it so much easier. Another favorite tool of mine that I keep in the craft room are these miter shears. They make cutting craft sticks to points really simple because you can adjust the angle on the shear itself. Now, if you don't have a pair of these, you could, of course, just use a pair of scissors, or you could leave the craft sticks rounded at the top. I think it would make this centerpiece just as cute. I just wanted to cut mine into a point because I wanted it to look like a picket fence. Because I was using the giant craft sticks, I only needed 16 pieces altogether to fit around my box. If you're using a different size wooden crate, or if you're using smaller craft sticks, you may have to adjust the total number that you'll need. For this crate and these sticks, I was able to fit 5 across on each of the long sides, and on the shorter sides, I spaced 3 across. Next, I grabbed some white chalk paint and I started doing a heavy dry brushing all over the container. This is where you can kind of get creative and customize this to fit your style. I like neutral colors, so I always like to use the white chalk paint, and I do like some of that wood grain showing through, which is why I like to do the dry brushing. But you could paint this a really bright fun color, or you could even stain it your favorite wood stain as well. If you wanted to create the centerpiece for Easter specifically, you could wrap some Easter ribbon around the center of this crate. I wanted to keep mine more neutral so that I could decorate it for different holidays and different seasons. So I just grabbed a piece of this thinner jute cord that I get from Amazon. I wrapped it around the center, and then rather than tying a bow and adding it to the center of the box, I offset it just a bit and added it to the right side of my box. Once I had a piece of floral foam glued into place, I used my glass jar that I was going to put my candle in, and I pressed it into the center so that I would have an idea of where I could place greenery and what space I needed to leave open in order to put the glass back in there. So once I had my mark down of where I needed that glass to be, then it was time to just have some fun with some pieces of greenery. I don't know about you, but I always have this giant Ziploc bag of greenery laying around from other pieces of floral that I've taken apart and used and then put back in the bag. So this is a great way to use up some of these scrap pieces of greenery. I added some greenery around the edges, and then because there were a few spaces in between some of the craft sticks where I created the fake fence, I added some of the pieces of greenery to look like it was growing out through the fence too. I thought that was really cute. Once I had the box filled in how I liked it, I grabbed a pack of these speckled Easter eggs, and I decided to tuck a few in also. You could leave this box decorated how you like it if you just want it for spring, but I wanted this to go from spring to Easter and then maybe into summer also. So I took some barbecue skewers, I poked some of these plastic eggs onto the skewers, and I just tucked them in here and there in between all of my florals. You'll need 8 of these tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. And I just hot glued 2 of them together, and I did that with all 8 of the blocks. I cut these 6 down into 4-inch lengths, and you'll need 12 of these all together. So once I had all of my craft sticks cut, I kind of lined them up, and I left just a slight little gap in between each of the 3 craft sticks. And then I hot glued one of those bigger blocks that we had glued together, and I glued it on the end, and I left just a little bit of a overhang of the craft sticks, because you'll see here now I'm gonna stack up the craft sticks, and we're forming a little box, if that helps you kind of understand what I'm doing here. So I glued another set of 3 craft sticks onto the end of the tumbling tower blocks, and then I repeated that on the other side. And then once all of that was in place, then that's whenever I hot glued the other 2 sets of blocks to the inside so that I could hot glue the remaining 3 sticks on the 4th side of the box. To create a base for the box, I just traced around the box on a piece of lightweight chipboard, but I wanted to get the box stained first before I put the base on. So I am just using my favorite antique wax by Waverly, and I brush it on, and then I like to wipe it off with either a paper towel or a baby wipe, because it really helps show the wood grain of the craft sticks a little bit more. So once I had the antique wax on everything, then I went back through with the plaster color by Waverly, and I dry brushed it on the box, but I did it kind of heavy because I wanted more of the plaster color to show. So now I'm taking the elephant color, and using a stylus tool, I'm just going to create dots in all of the corners of the box to kind of look like little fake nail heads that are sticking out of the box. So it kind of gives it that faux look like it's nailed together, but it isn't. And then I glued the base of the box on. Now that the box is all put together, I'm going to put floral foam on the inside, and then using hot glue, I'm going to cover the top with the floral moss. And then this is where you can kind of get creative. So I just decided to stick a couple white flowers in mine, and then I did tuck one of these little sequined red hearts from the Dollar Tree, but I didn't glue anything in so that way I can change it out later for other seasons. The Dollar Tree always has some of the most amazing gift bags at Christmas time. So when I saw this one that says Christmas Tree Farm, I knew that I wanted to create a wall hanging out of it. And it's nice and big too, so it's always nice to have bigger pieces at Christmas time. So I just measured the bottom of the bag where that little border is, and then I measured from the top too, just to make sure that it was spaced evenly. And then I just cut the image off of the front of the bag. To create the wood pieces for the top and the bottom of the wall hanging, I'm using these giant craft sticks. Now, if I had painter's stir sticks on hand, I think that probably would have fit across the top of the bag, and you could have just used one stick. But since I didn't have any of those on hand, that's why I chose to use the craft sticks. So I'm cutting down 4 for the top and 4 for the bottom. And I think my sticks ended up measuring out at about 6.5 inches because my bag was about 13 inches across. I wanted a darker stain for my craft sticks, so I mixed together the antique wax by Waverly with just a little bit of the ink chalk paint, and that way it kind of darkened it up a little bit. So to apply to my craft sticks, I decided to use a wet wipe because I wanted to dilute it, and I wanted to be able to see that wood grain through the stain more. And I would say that I probably mixed about 3 parts antique wax to 1 part of the ink color chalk paint. I really lucked out with these craft sticks because they had a nice wood grain pattern to them. Sometimes it's a gamble. You never really know what you're going to get out of those packs. So to attach my craft sticks together, I'm just using a little bit of Scotch tape to hold them together. And then I'm using my tiny attacher by Tim Holtz, which is just a mini stapler, to add 2 staples to the seam between the 2 sticks. And then I did that for all 4 sets of the sticks because I wanted to create a little bit more weight on the bottom of this wall hanging. That's why I decided to add craft sticks to the front and back side of this wall hanging. And if you don't have the tiny attacher, you could just use a regular stapler, or you could just glue the 2 sticks together. Next, I just hot glued my sets of sticks to the top and the bottom of my gift bag. Now, if you wanted this to be a little bit more stable, you could add the gift bag to a piece of foam core board or even a piece of poster board, but I felt that the weight of the sticks along the bottom would keep it from curling up as it's hanging on the wall. The great thing about using gift bags for Christmas crafts is it's so easy to customize. If you like more of the glam or bling style for Christmas, you could get a really sparkly gift bag and cut that out, and then instead of staining the craft sticks, you could paint them with some metallic paint or even cover them with some rhinestones or pearls or a nice shiny ribbon. It really is easy to customize when you're using gift bags. I have a tool called A Dile, and it will pretty much chomp a hole through most materials, so I knew it would cut a hole through the 2 layers of the craft sticks. So I just marked out on the top of the gift bag where I wanted my hangers to go, and I used my Dile just to, like I said, punch out a hole. But if you don't have the Dile, you could definitely use a drill, or you wouldn't even have to do that. You could just hot glue a ribbon to the back side of the bag instead. Since the Christmas trees on the front of this bag had that black and red buffalo plaid print on them, I thought that this black and red plaid ribbon that I found at Walmart would be a really nice hanger for the wall hanging. So I just fished the ribbon from the back side of the sign through the front, and I tied it in a knot, and then I looped it over to the other side and did the same thing. I trimmed the excess off the fronts of the knots, and then I just created a simple loopy bow, and I glued that to the top of the piece of ribbon just to add a little bit more character to my wall hanging. Dollar Tree always has great blank wood pieces for every holiday. I grabbed one of their wooden pumpkins. I also grabbed a pack of their window clings because I really liked this Hello Autumn quote that's in the center of this one. And I am using some of the larger craft sticks from Walmart. I just held up one of the regular craft sticks so you could see how much bigger it was. I started by picking out 3 paint colors that I thought would match the colors of the window cling. Here I'm using hazelnut, moss, and just plain white chalk paint. I'm painting a whole bunch of craft sticks with those 3 colors. I wasn't really sure how many craft sticks I would need. I kind of laid them out first to give myself an estimate of how many I thought I would need, and I figured I would need about 21, and that actually worked out pretty well for me. So I just painted 7 of each color. After my paint was dry, I needed to cut down my craft sticks. First, I started by cutting off the rounded edges, and then I just cut each of the craft sticks in half, which was about 3 1/4 to 3 1/2 inches. The length really didn't matter here, but I just went through and I did that with all 21 of my craft sticks. I wanted to bricklay these sticks all over the surface of my pumpkin. So to get started, I'm just starting at the bottom left side of my pumpkin here, and I picked my green stick first because that was the first one in my piles. And I'm adding hot glue really close to the edge of the pumpkin. So you can see I did lay my silicone mat down because I knew I was going to have a lot of glue oozing out through the bottom, and I wanted to protect my work surface. So I laid the hot glue as close as I could to the edge of the pumpkin, and then I added hot glue to the back side of the craft sticks as well, and I just alternated colors throughout the bottom row. Now the reason I wanted to get glue as close as I could to the edge of the pumpkin is because I am going to go through with scissors to trim off the excess craft stick. So if there was glue right to the edge of that pumpkin, it gave me a better chance of getting a cleaner cut with my scissors, because craft sticks kind of have a tendency to fray and come apart when you try to cut them with scissors. And because I was going to be cutting on curves and different angles, I wanted to give myself the best chance to have a nice clean cut with just my scissors. So you can see here on the bottom, it went pretty well with my scissors. The bottom looks pretty good. I'm going to clean it up later with a sanding block. And I just continued that the whole way up the pumpkin. I made sure that when I started a new row that the seams of the craft sticks didn't line up. I wanted to make sure that there was a seam in the center of the previous craft stick, just like a bricklay pattern would go. And I did just continue alternating the colors as I went through the different rows. It didn't really matter to me if I had some of the same color stacked on top of each other. I just wanted a nice mix match of color all through the pumpkins. And when I got to the sides of the pumpkin, I made sure I did the same thing, that there was hot glue right up to the edge of the side of the pumpkin and on the back of the craft stick, so that when I cut it with my scissors, I had a better even cut. And I did go up the whole height of the pumpkin, but I did not cover the stem because I was going to cover that with something different. Now that I have all of my sticks glued down and trimmed off, I did go back through with my sanding block, and anywhere the edges were a bit rough or anywhere that the sticks kind of splintered, I did go through with the sanding block and I smoothed that out as best as I could. Now, because the sticks are wood, because the pumpkins are wood, it sanded off pretty smooth. I was happy with how the edges looked, and the sanding block did take care of any of the extra hot glue that was sticking out of the sides as well. And where I had those little curves on the bottom, I was able to fit the corner of the sanding block in there just to smooth that out and to define those curves a bit more. There's a lot of different options when it comes to covering the stem. I decided just to add some hot glue and wrap the whole stem in some jute cord, but you could just paint it. I mean, if you're feeling really ambitious, you could even run those craft sticks up through the stem and try to cut that out, but I wasn't about to go on that journey. So I just used some jute cord, covered mine up. I had to add hot glue as I went, especially when I got to the more curvier parts of the stem, but it all curved up pretty well, and I was happy with how the jute cord looked with the colors that I had picked for the craft sticks. After I had the whole stem covered in the jute cord, I used the same jute cord and I took 2 lengths of it to create a thicker bow, and I just hot glued that to the base of the stem. When I bought this set of window clings, I thought that they would have a white background. I wasn't expecting the clings to have a clear background. And when I laid it on my pumpkin, it kind of got lost. You know, with all the colors there, they matched up so well that you really couldn't see what was going on. So I took a piece of white cardstock. I just added a little Mod Podge to the back of my window cling, and I laid it over the white cardstock so that I could cut it out later and it would have a white background and it would stand out on the pumpkin a bit more. And since I now have a cardstock backer for my window clean, I used my art glitter glue and I just applied glue all over the back of it and put it on the front of the pumpkin. You could also pop this up here too if you wanted to add some craft sticks on the back so that it would lift up a little bit, but I thought with the white background I would just glue it flat down on my pumpkin. I picked up these 2 yard stakes from the Dollar Tree, not because I wanted to put them in my yard, but because I really liked how thick the wooden heart was that was on the stick. I want to turn these into a planter for my front door, so I'm going to use 2 of those and a pack of these super jumbo wooden craft sticks that I get from Walmart. The sticks were pretty easy to pop off the back of these wooden hearts. The first one broke as I popped it off. The second one came off in one piece, but I was able to use a staple remover to remove the piece that had broken off. I also had to remove the stickers, and I'm not sure why there was a hole at the top with a ribbon in it. I don't know why you would want to hang a yard stake in your house, but that was okay. I took that off too. Then I got to work cutting down my jumbo craft sticks. I was able to get 2 pieces out of each craft stick. I cut them down to 3 1/4 inches. I did go through the pack a bit and make sure that I had the sticks that were the straightest and not warped, because it would make it easier to put this project together. Now, before I get started on painting everything, I want to glue everything together. So I'm taking those craft sticks that I had cut down and I laid one of my wooden hearts down, and you can see I have the word love facing me. That's going to be on the inside of my hanging planter. And I'm just taking my craft sticks and I'm lining it up with the bottom edge of the side of the wooden heart, and I glued about 8 sticks on each side. So once I had the first set of sticks glued in place on the one side, then I was able to add the second heart by placing some hot glue along the edges of the sticks that I had lined up, and I just put the second wooden heart on that edge. Now I did go through, and where I had hot glued those sticks to the edge of the heart, I went through and added some hot glue on the inside just to make it a little more secure and sturdy. After all my sticks were in place on one side of the heart, then I repeated that on the second side, just adding hot glue to each end of the sticks and attaching them to both hearts. I chose to paint my container white. I'm using some white chalk paint here, and because that red is so dark, I did have to give it 2 coats on the hearts. I made sure that I got the hearts and the sticks, and then I did paint some white paint down in the inside. I didn't bother getting the whole inside because I knew you wouldn't be able to see it. I just did the top 3 inches or so, just in case any of that peeked out from the inside. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know I love to distress and age things, so I'm using some of the mineral paint by Waverly and a big chippy brush, and I'm just distressing all of the edges of my container. Now, like I say in most of my videos, if you don't like that distressed look, whenever you're painting anything, you can change it up to fit your style. And another suggestion I have too, if you don't want to paint this container at all, you could use some of the peel and stick wallpaper that you can get at the Dollar Tree, and you could cover these hearts in the wallpaper. That was actually my initial idea for this container, was to use some of that wallpaper, but when I dug through my craft supplies, I couldn't find 2 pieces of the same paper. I had a bunch of different random patterns, but I knew I needed 2 because I was using 2 hearts. So that's just another idea for you if you don't really care for the distressed look. Now you can decorate the front of your container however you'd like. I have some of these really pretty stencils from Essential Stencils. This video isn't sponsored and I'm not affiliated with them at all, but I do really like their stencils, so I'll leave a link in the description box for their website if you want to look through. I've always had really good luck with their rub-on transfers. They come off really easily. I just use a craft stick when I'm placing them on something. I cut apart one of the big flowers, and then there were some little bumblebees in this pack too, so I added a few of those to the front of my container. Now the Dollar Tree does carry a pretty big selection of rub-on transfers, so you could always find something there, or this would be a great place to use some window clings that you might have. You could just Mod Podge those to the front of your container. I'm using some thinner jute rope to act as a hanger for my container. I get this from Amazon. It's a little bit thinner than the stuff you can get from the Dollar Tree. Anytime I'm cutting a length of rope that I'm going to glue to the inside of something that you're not actually going to see the ends for it, I like to take a piece of clear tape and wrap it around it and then cut through the center of the clear tape. That way it holds the ends together on the piece that I'm going to use, and it also keeps the ends together on the part of the roll that I'm not going to use. So then I just use some hot glue to attach the 2 ends to the inside of my container. Before hanging it on my front door, I added in a few bunches of some pretty spring flowers. I decided to make my own wooden crate because I like the ones that you can find at the Dollar Tree, but they're kind of small and I wanted something just a little bit bigger. So I'm using some of the square wooden planks that you can find at the Dollar Tree, and then I'm using these giant craft sticks that I get from Walmart. And if you've watched my videos before, you know that my favorite way to cut craft sticks is to use my paper trimmer. So I took these giant craft sticks and I cut them down to about 8 3/4 inches. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that I'm actually cutting 9 of these craft sticks all together. Assembling the crate is pretty easy. I'm just going to start with one of the square wooden planks, and I ran the hot glue along the edge, and I kind of lined one of the craft sticks up along the bottom edge of the first wooden plank. And then once I had that craft stick in place, then I repeated the same thing on the other wooden plank. That way it kind of made it a little bit more stable to be able to add the other craft sticks. So once I had that bottom one in place, then I was able to start adding the other ones on 3 of the sides. And I did go ahead and reinforce the inside of each of the sticks, like where the sticks and the wooden plank met. I added just a little bit more hot glue just to reinforce it. But if you wanted to take that a step farther, you could also use a staple gun and just kind of shoot a staple right on top of that stick into the wooden plank just to make it a little bit more sturdy. And then it would look kind of cool too to have the staples on there because it would make it look a little bit more rustic around the edges of the crate. So So once I had the bottom sticks in place on the two wooden planks, then I went ahead and moved to the top. And I wanted to make sure that those were lined up with the very top edge of the wooden planks. And I did both sides of that, and then I was able to just kind of take the third stick that belonged on each side and just kind of eyeball the center of where it should be in between the two sticks. After I had both sides done, then I went ahead and just repeated the same process along the bottom of the crate too. But if you wanted to add some kind of floral arrangement to this where you didn't want the slats in the bottom, you could just use a piece of cardboard or something on the bottom too if you wanted to. But I like the look of the sticks the whole way around, so that's why I chose to do the sticks on 3 of the sides of this crate. I wanted to keep the outside of the crate pretty simple because I knew that I would be leaving this up year round. So I decided to take some of the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I just gave it a good dry brushing all over the outside and the inside of the crate because I really like that rustic kind of farmhouse look. So that's why I like to dry brush a lot of times on pieces like this because it really fits in with my home's decor. But again, this is one of the times that you could customize this to fit any kind of decor. If you spray painted this black, it would look a little bit more modern or a little bit more industrial. So there's a lot of ways that you could change this up too to fit different styles. To create handles for this crate, I decided to use some of this faux leather ribbon from the Dollar Tree. So I started by cutting a piece that was 12 inches long, and then I just folded it in half and ran just a little bit of hot glue down the center. I didn't want too much because I didn't want there to be like a big glob in there that you could see through the ribbon. So once I had it folded it in half, then I just trimmed the edges off so that they kind of matched. And then to add a little more detail, I'm using my tiny attacher by Tim Holtz, and I'm just adding a few staples along each of the edges just to give it a little bit more of a fun little kind of embellishment on the handle. To attach the handles to the crate, I just held my roller up on the side and I added a dot of hot glue about a half an inch from each edge. And then I was able to lay the piece that had the staples on it on top of that hot glue. That way I knew it was spaced evenly on the side of the crate. I'm going to be using one of these giant craft sticks, a piece of cardstock cut at 3 3/4 by 5, a piece of this greenery from the Dollar Tree. I think they're about 12 inches long, and a few embellishments. So I started by cutting the giant craft stick down into 2 pieces that was about 4 inches in length. Then I decided to give each of the craft sticks a quick coat of the ink color by Waverly. So then next I'm taking the cardstock that I had already cut, and I'm using just a small piece of jute, and that's going to be the hanger for this ornament. So I ran a little bit of hot glue along the bottom and added the jute, and then I added the cardstock right over top of that hot glue. And this is going to make kind of like a little scroll banner type of ornament. And then all I had to do was glue the second stick across the bottom of the banner. I decided to create a mini wreath with one of these garland ties for in the center of the banner, and since these have a wire running through them, it makes it really easy to do that. So I kind of fluffed it out a little bit, wrapped it around my fingers a few times, and then twisted the ends in. Then all I had to do was hot glue it onto the center of the banner and then add a few berries and pine cones for embellishments. I'm using one of these square pieces of wall art that you can find at the Dollar Tree, and I just removed the hardware from the back, and then I used my utility knife to take the canvas print off of the frame because I only needed the frame for this project. Next I took the truffle color by Waverly, and I just gave the frame one good coat of the truffle color. I kept my brush dirty with the truffle color, and I used a little bit of the mineral color, and I dry brushed that around the frame just to distress it a little bit. To create a backing for this frame, I'm using these giant craft sticks, and I just laid out so that I could see how many I would need to cover the back of the frame. Then I kind of painted the sticks the opposite of how I painted the frame. So I went through and I painted all the sticks the mineral color, And then I went back over and dry brushed with the truffle color. But after I got done with the dry brushing, I thought the truffle color kind of stood out just a little bit too much. So I did use my sanding block and I kind of sanded the paint down just a bit to help mute that distressing a little bit more. Once all my sticks were dry, then I trimmed them down to fit the frame and I was able to hot glue them onto the back of the frame. I did have to cut one of the sticks lengthwise in order to fit across the back of the frame, but if you've watched my videos before, you know that I feel the easiest way to cut craft sticks is to use a paper trimmer, so that wasn't really a big deal. They had these really cool anchors at the Dollar Tree this year. So I bought one of the white ones and I really liked it how it was. I didn't really want to do much to it, but I did take my sanding block over it just a bit, just to distress it a little bit. And I really liked actually the rope that was tied on the top of it, so I left that there too. And I just took a little bit of hot glue and I glued it right into the center of the frame. I'm always looking for ways to use up craft supplies that I already have in my stash. So for this project, I'm using some of these giant craft sticks, an old piece of art that I got from the Dollar Tree, and a wooden heart also from the Dollar Tree. I started by taking this square piece of art and I removed the hardware from the back, and then I used my utility knife to cut away the canvas design. And I wasn't worried about taking out the staples for this project because I knew they wouldn't be in my way. Next, I got out my paper trimmer and I cut my craft sticks down to fit my frame. I cut one first and made sure that it was a good length, and then I cut the rest of them the same lengths. Depending on what size frame you'll use, you'll have to take your own measurements to figure out how long you need your sticks and how many sticks you'll need for your piece. Now I could get to work on painting everything. I took my favorite color by Waverly, the plaster color, and I gave the frame one medium coat. I left a little of the wood show through here and there, but it wasn't just a dry brushing. It was a little more opaque than that. While my frame was drying, I got to work on the wooden heart, and because I didn't really have the perfect watermelon color that I needed, I decided to make my own, and I used mostly the ballet slipper color by Waverly, and I added just a touch of the crimson to it to deepen it up slightly. I set the heart aside to dry and I got to work on the craft sticks. I started with the fern color and I gave each of the craft sticks one pretty good coat of this color. Once that first coat of green had dried, I took the moss color, also by Waverly, and I dry brushed it with a smaller brush right down the center to sort of mimic the stripes that are on a watermelon. I also used the plaster color again to dry brush around the edges of the heart to give it a little more character. As a finishing touch for my watermelon heart, I took this black Sharpie paint pen and I used it to draw on some little seeds. The seeds that I drew on were teardrop shape, and I tried to turn them in different directions so it didn't look like it was all kind of uniform and going in the same way. I wanted it to look kind of sporadic and random. Now that all my paint was dry, I could start assembling my frame. I started with the craft sticks and I'm using some hot glue to attach them to the back side of the frame. I just kind of eyeballed where the center was and I laid my center stick down first, and then I worked my way out to both sides so that when I got to the end of the frame, it was a little bit easier to see how much of the width of the stick that I needed to trim off to fit within the back side of my frame. And the last thing I needed to do to finish off this piece of watermelon art was use some hot glue to glue my heart down to the center. Thanks so much for coming to hang out with me in the craft room again today. If you want even more crafting inspiration, check out one of the videos I left on the screen. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.